I invite the House to take note that today we are using the wooden mace. This mace reminds us of the fire that claimed 7 lives and destroyed the original Parliament building, except for the library, on the night of February 3rd, 1916.
There was the old mace. The wooden copy that you see today was subsequently made and used temporarily until the current one was given to us by the United Kingdom in 1917. As the House will not be sitting Saturday, the anniversary of the fire, the wooden mace is being used today to recall what happened 108 years ago. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day. Ordre du jour. Ordre émanant du gouvernement.
Government orders. Government bills. Commons. Resuming third reading of Bill C-57, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement Implementation Act 2023. Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture, and Agri-Food. That's fine, Madam Speaker. It's Friday for everyone.
In the House today in support of this historic legislation to implement the modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. This is an incredibly important agreement for both Canada and Ukraine, and I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate what this legislation will accomplish. The Canada-Ukraine bilateral relationship is long-standing, unique, and unshakable, and has always been marked by Canada's steadfast support of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Recently, in the face of protracted Russian aggression abroad and rising isolationism here in Canada, Canada's assistance has become even more important. Canadian aid for Ukraine in its time of need has included military, diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian support. Trade is an important component of Canada's economic support, which should not be overlooked. The modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement is an important element in our support to our Ukrainian allies. Not only will it help strengthen the bilateral economic ties between our two great countries, but it provides to the world yet another sign of Canada's unflappable support for our Ukrainian allies. Madam Speaker, this agreement constitutes a measure of support that will not only offer benefits in the near term, but will extend well beyond Russia's illegal and unjustified war of aggression by strengthening the foundation on which Canadian and Ukrainian businesses can work together during Ukraine's recovery and economic reconstruction, and indeed underpin the long-term economic relationship between our two countries. We know that Ukraine's economy can benefit from Canadian expertise and investment in key sectors such as infrastructure, resources, energy, and finance. This agreement makes it easier for Canadian companies to supply goods and services to Ukraine during reconstruction, as well as invest and operate in the Ukrainian market with greater confidence, while also supporting Ukrainian companies and exporting their goods and services to Canada. As you are aware, the Prime Minister and Ukrainian President Zelensky announced their intention to modernize the trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine in 2019. This is in response to a clause contained in the original 2017 agreement committing Canada and Ukraine to review the agreement within 2 years of its entry into force, with the view to expanding it. While comprehensive from a trade in goods perspective, the 2017 agreement did not include chapters on trades in services or investment. These areas were specifically identified by the review clause as potential additions without restricting the parties from exploring other areas. As such, this was an opportunity to make this agreement a fully comprehensive one, on par with Canada's most comprehensive free trade agreements. It is toward that goal that our government announced the launch of the agreement modernization negotiations in January 2022. Unfortunately, only weeks after, Russia began its full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. As part of our support to Ukraine, Canadian trade officials relayed to their Ukrainian counterparts that they stood ready to proceed with the agreement modernization discussions in accordance with Ukraine's capacity and willingness to do so. In May 2022, Ukraine conveyed in no uncertain terms that it was ready to initiate and indeed expedite the trade agreement modernization negotiations, and that they were both eager and determined to move forward to conclude as quickly as possible. Thus, our trade officials got to work immediately with the goal of reaching an ambitious and high standard agreement on a rapid time frame. Throughout the process, and despite difficult circumstances, Ukraine demonstrated eagerness to reach an ambitious outcome within very short timelines, with the aim of facilitating increased trade between our two countries, not just to meet the immediate needs of reconstruction, but long into the future. This eagerness is reflected of how comprehensive the Modernized Agreement is with respect to not only trades in good, but also to the new chapters and provisions for investments, services, labor, environment, inclusive trade, and others. In this current context, the new areas covered in the Modernized Agreement make it much more than just a trade agreement. As Ukraine's first Deputy Prime Minister, Zverykenko, has explained, this agreement is a way to demonstrate that Ukraine's economy is, and I quote, built on the same principles of respect for workers and the environment as in Canada. This is the first agreement that confirms that Ukraine shares the trade agenda of Canada, the US, the EU, Japan, and our other partners. Its text is based on the standard of the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. In this way, Ukraine is joining countries that share the same principles of economic policy. In fact, this is a modern, trained, and legally binding economic pact with partners who support our security. Madam Speaker, this is why this modernized agreement is so important for Ukraine, and why, despite truly incredible and daunting circumstances, Ukraine dedicated scarce resources towards that goal and pushed forward this modernization with Canada. Beyond the short-term benefits related to the reconstruction efforts that will be needed, they did so because they recognized and acknowledged the long-term importance of building and safeguarding an open and inclusive rules-based global trading system, a system that contributes to creating strong and resilient economies and enables long-term growth. Madam Speaker, increasing Canada's trade and attractive investment is a priority for this government, as is Canada's continued support for Ukraine, both during and long after the war. And for this reason, I urge all members to support Bill C-57 and allow this government to move ahead to implement the modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement on a timely basis. Thank you so much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments?
The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Madam Speaker, I'm wondering if my colleague opposite, in the context of this agreement, will commit right now to talking to the Prime Minister and to his caucus to strongly commit Canada to repurpose seized Russian assets back to Ukraine. Will he commit to ensuring that Canada leads a G7 effort to send back seized assets to Ukraine?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Tell you what, Madam Speaker, I will entertain a conversation with the Prime Minister if she entertains a conversation with the Leader of the Official Opposition to ensure its support of Bill C-57 and its support for Ukraine.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. This is a very important bill. Moreover, the 2017 agreement negotiated under the Conservative government primarily was just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We know that ended in 2015, just before the end of the invasion, but we know the agreement was signed in 2016, just before it came into force in 2017. So it was under the Conservatives of Stephen Harper that it was negotiated, and now we're saying that the Conservatives are no longer on board. What explains this, and what are the repercussions of this? Thank you. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. He raised this an important point. I don't know what happened to the Conservative Party of Brian Mulroney, who believed in free trade agreements, and for some reason, the Leader of the Official Opposition decided to no longer support an agenda that promotes free trade, even if the president of Ukraine and Ukraine has clearly said that they want Canada to support this agreement of free trade. I no longer understand where the Conservative Party is going in 2024.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague. Let me ask him a question as far as words versus actions on this, because I see a lot of paper, I see a lot of words, but as far as the actions in supporting Ukraine goes, they've been a day late and a dollar short almost every time. Will he commit to actually supporting Ukraine, as he hasn't done, he and his party and his government haven't done in the past, as far as returning the turbine when President Zelensky said, please don't return this turbine, as far as cutting off the oil trade that Russia was importing into Canada far later than this party recommended they should, because they're funding the war for Russia and Ukraine. Will he commit to actually performing better as far as the real metrics go, as opposed to the paper metrics?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, we can all strive to do better, and I would encourage this member to do better as well and to support Bill C-57.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I'm finding it somewhat odd that you have Conservative members that are actually standing up asking about the government's position with regards to Ukraine, when in fact what we have witnessed is the Conservative Party has completely abandoned Ukraine on this very important issue of Canada-Ukraine trade. First time ever the Conservatives are going to be voting against a trade agreement, Madam Speaker. I'm wondering if my colleague would not agree with me that there's a possibility of an oozement of hypocrisy and disappointment all in one in regards to the way in which the Conservative Party today is treating a very important trade agreement.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, I have to agree with the honourable member, but we know that the leader of the official opposition is getting advice on high grocery prices from a lobbyist called Jenny Burns. But I'm wondering if they're getting advice from a foreign policy from Tucker Carlson now, who's been really strong advocate to support Russia. Like, I just don't understand where the Conservative Party of Canada is going with this lack of support for Ukraine. It's about high time they stand up and support Ukraine and pass this bill as soon as possible.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's a pleasure to rise today and to speak on Bill C-57, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Deal. And I'll be sharing my time with the Honourable Member from Calgary-Nose Hill. First of all, I want to start off by saying unequivocally the Conservatives support Ukraine. I want to say it again because there's been a lot of misinformation from the other side. Conservatives stand with and unequivocally support Ukraine, as we always have. In 1991, it was a Conservative government that was the first Western country to recognize Ukraine's independence. And it was under the Stephen Harper government that the initial Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement was negotiated. And so, you know, we already have a free trade agreement. I think the discussion today needs to be about what should be in the agreement and what should not be in the agreement. Now, I also want to share with the House my personal support for Ukraine. When the war first happened and people were having to flee, this government failed to send planes to rescue them. They created a bureaucratic 2-month process to get your papers to get here. I hired extra staff in my office and worked with local organizations and people that were on the ground in Ukraine to bring 200 families to Sarnia-Lambton, to find sponsor homes for them, to get jobs for them and English training services. So unequivocally, I support Ukraine. But let's look at the Liberal record. Initially, when President Zelensky said, please do not provide this turbine to Russia so that they can fuel and fund their war machine, the Liberals sent the turbine. They allowed Canada to supply detonators for mines that are being used to blow up Ukrainians. How in any way is that support? The Ukrainians have asked Canada for our LNG to replace the Russian fuels that they were using. And Canada refused. That's something that ought to be in this agreement, and it's not. And The Liberals, although they promised the surface-to-air missiles over a year ago, they still haven't been delivered. So clearly, there's a problem in terms of the Liberals listening to what Ukraine is asking for, because none of that is in here. Instead, they decided to put carbon tax language into this agreement. Now, the Conservatives have negotiated, over 50 trade deals. All of the trade deals that have ever been negotiated with Canada have never contained any of that language. And why was it necessary, since Ukraine already has a carbon pricing mechanism on industrial emissions? It's minor, but certainly Ukrainians who are trying to recover and win a war, the last thing they're going to need is to be put under the same regime that Canadians are suffering under, that has driven up the cost of food, home heating, all of these things. Ukrainians definitely don't need that. And so I want to highlight a couple of other things that are ongoing. Of course, we have always supported the Operation Ukraine to provide aid, but there's more that Canada can do. Ukraine is asking for munitions from Canada, but the Liberals voted against the Conservative motion to send those and are still delaying sending the kinds of munitions that would actually help Ukraine to win this war. I think when you talk about the record of the Liberals, it's just clear that they want to seem to be updating a trade agreement that already exists without actually putting into it the things that the partners would need. I think the real crux of the matter here, Madam Speaker, is that they also refuse to fix the bill. So when the bill went to committee, it was clear from the member from Dufferin-Caledon, he brought numerous amendments that would have helped this act. First of all, we agreed that if they removed the references to carbon pricing and carbon leakage, that the Conservatives would willingly support this agreement. But the government has refused, even though, like I said, Ukraine already has made their decisions about what they're going to do about carbon tax. And so they are a sovereign nation. They have every right to do that. We shouldn't be putting that into a trade agreement. He also brought an amendment that would provide energy trade and nuclear technology like small modular reactors. Now, this is really important. There's an energy crisis and an energy opportunity going on in Europe right now. And every time they come and ask for our help, Canadians who want to help are just surprised to see the Liberals refuse. Germany wanted to give us $58 billion for our LNG. They said there's no business case for that. So Australia took that deal. And the Netherlands wanted to do a deal with us. And we said there's no business case. So Qatar took that deal. Japan wanted to do. I mean, the list goes on and on of opportunities where we've had the wherewithal to really help, and have refused, Madam Speaker. And so, all of these amendments that were brought have been turned down. And I don't know why they wouldn't accept one that talks about nuclear technology. That's a very green technology. It should fit in with what the Liberals are proposing to do. The other amendment that they voted against, and this is really troubling, is an amendment to increase defense supplies to donate to Ukraine. Ukraine is running out of munitions. And we have a lot of munitions that are not currently being used across the country that could be repurposed and sent. But the Liberals voted against this amendment, as did the NDP. It's the NDP and the Liberals standing together to not support Ukraine. And so I really don't understand, Madam Speaker, how they can stand up every day and not know their own record on not giving Ukraine what they need. The other thing that they voted against, another troubling thing, is there was an amendment to have the Business Development Bank of Canada support projects in Ukraine to develop their own munitions manufacturing capacity. I think this is, a concrete way that Canada could have helped. We're already sending billions to everyone in the world. Who needs it more than Ukraine, that's currently at war with Russia, which is a threat to the whole Western world? So I have no idea why the Liberals won't give the Ukrainians what they're asking for. And that is really the discussion that we're having today. We already have a free trade agreement. We're going to continue to do trade with Ukraine. Conservatives are dedicated in supporting Ukraine, but we are not going to force a carbon tax regime to make things worse than they already are. We'll let Ukraine deal with whatever they want to put in place with their sovereignty. But meanwhile, we want to give them what they're asking for. And they're asking for Canada to help with LNG. They're asking Canada to help with munitions. They're asking Canada to help with financial aid to support projects to rebuild their nation. These are the kinds of things that should be in a free trade agreement between Canada and the Ukraine if we want to modernize the one that's already there. But it's not. And we continue to see, in my riding, difficulties that the Ukrainians are having in trying to rescue other people that are coming. As the ravages of war are advancing, there are still people that want to come, and the Liberals haven't made this process any easier. And I think if they really want to help Ukrainians, they should recognize that there's a huge need. There's a need in other areas where we could be of help. We have a lot of armored ambulances, for example, and we're not using them. We've replaced them. But the other ones are still there. They need an oil change, maybe, and a new set of tires. Those are the kinds of things that we could be sending to Ukraine. They're hauling people around in, broken down cars because they've got no ambulances left. So these are the kinds of things, Madam Speaker, that I think we should be thinking about. I see that I'm being called to wrap it up, so I'll wrap it up where I started. Conservatives unconditionally support Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine. That was clear from 1991 when we recognized their independence. It was clear when President Zelensky was here asking for our help, and my colleague Candice Bergen stood in this place and unequivocally said we support Ukraine. The current leader has said we unequivocally support Ukraine. That is the record. That is the correction of the misinformation and disinformation from the members opposite. And Madam Speaker, we need to help Ukraine. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Speaker, the member that just spoke is wrong. President Zelensky comes to Canada last September, and he came to Canada to sign a trade agreement. That's why, at the time of war, comes to Canada to sign a trade agreement. He's asking parliamentarians here, all of us, to support the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement. So is the Canadian Congress, Ukrainian Congress in Canada. So is the 1.3 million people of Ukrainian heritage and others. They want all members of all political parties to get behind and vote in favor of this legislation. Why is members of the Conservative Party chosen to abandon Ukraine when Ukraine is asking for the support of this legislation?
Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and the member opposite is wrong. We absolutely support Ukraine, and we have absolutely said that if the language about carbon pricing is removed from this agreement, we would sign on, and we'd like to add a few more things that Ukraine is actually asking for, like the LNG, like munitions, like some of the ambulances that we have and extra equipment, things that were taken and seized that belong to Russia would be an advantage to them. So there's a lot of things that we would like to do, but certainly we don't want to inflict a carbon tax that's already doubling costs in Canada and causing unaffordability.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague Sarnia-Lambton for her speech. One thing to start. In her speech, she said that the Conservatives unconditionally support Ukraine, and it's not true that they're against Ukraine. It's a bit false, at least the perception, and perception is quite strong, Madam Speaker. The perception is they're voting against this bill simply because it talks about the carbon tax or carbon pricing, and this goes against their current ideology. This is a shame because it goes against the good that this could do. On another point, there is a fight against corruption in Ukraine, and they have committed to strongly fight corruption, and it's in the treaty. There is no mechanism to ensure cooperation. My colleague from Santia Santabat passed the only amendment that went through in committee, and it will help us fight together against corruption because it's a major issue during the post-war reconstruction. I'd like to know the opposition to the bill, C-57. Does my colleague think that this is not important? The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for that question. I don't think that the Liberal government can fix anything when it comes to corruption. They are experts on that subject, that is, on corruption. There are a number of agreements that we have signed with other countries. There is no carbon tax in those other agreements. Why is there mention here in this agreement that exists between Canada and Ukraine? I don't know. But if the carbon tax is eliminated, we will support it. Thank you.
And comments, the Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for her intervention. You know, I have a fairly sizable Ukraine community within my riding, and I want to give a special shout out to Stefan and Slav, who've worked very closely with me around all the ways that they're doing incredible work to send money back to Ukraine, to help people who are settling from Ukraine, and many other functions. The concern here is that they understand that Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and one of the things that's been very clear in asking Canadians is to step forward and provide support, and this trade agreement is a fundamental caveat of that ask. And I'm just wondering if the member does not hear from her Ukraine community how concerned they are that the Conservatives are simply not supporting this when they don't see any attachment to a carbon tax. It just doesn't make sense to a sovereign nation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton in 20 seconds.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. What I would say is I meet regularly with the many Ukrainians who have come. I want to thank the Save Ukraine Sarnia-Lambton group and people like Dr. Cassandra Taylor who have provided supports and welcomed our family of Ukrainians in. They certainly know unequivocally I support and unequivocally the Conservative Party supports. And I would remind everyone that we already have a trade agreement and that Ukraine...
And we have to resume debate. The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me begin by quoting a former colleague of mine. Ukraine is defending itself against unjustified aggression, the Kremlin's naked attempt to destroy a country's statehood, infrastructure, and identity. Full collective support for Ukraine's victory is the right, legal, moral, military, and strategic course of action. I strongly support this position. Putin's war of aggression is not just against Ukraine. His war machine attempts to undermine the Western consensus for democracy, the rule of law, and the pursuit of equality of opportunity. And so, now to Canada's role in this fight and the substance of this bill. This bill proposes updates to Canada's existing free trade agreement with Ukraine. I support free trade with Ukraine. I do not support every measure in this bill, and I take particular issue with the Liberals' inclusion of a carbon tax within the text. And that is because in the Canadian context, the Liberal carbon tax has dramatically increased the cost of living for every single one of the people I represent, all while failing to bring Canada anywhere close to meeting its emissions targets. It's not solving the urgent question of climate change. It is a clearly flawed policy that creates economic harm, and those who adhere to its ideology without questions put up roadblocks that have stifled the policy innovation needed to reduce emissions. I can simultaneously hold the position that I support free trade with Ukraine, I support the victory of Ukraine over Putin, and oppose a carbon tax. There are tens of millions of other Canadians who feel the exact same way. For the Liberals or the NDP or the Bloc or anyone else to suggest that to develop ways for Canada to support Ukraine, that I have to capitulate on my position on a carbon tax, misses the point of democracy, which is what we are ostensibly trying to fight for. In a dire crisis situation such as the one Ukraine finds itself in, fighting against the war of aggression being waged by Putin, It is the Liberal government that should have been working collaboratively to find a unified path forward. If they are unwilling to budge on the inclusion of a carbon tax in this agreement, then the onus was on them to build consensus with the Canadian public and acknowledge that we can have internal differences on a carbon tax while supporting Ukraine. It is a dangerous, deadly game for the Prime Minister of Canada and anyone in this place to repeatedly suggest that if a Canadian opposes a carbon tax, they must support Putin. This is a disgusting, morally bankrupt, and fundamentally anti-democratic, politically motivated aspersion that serves only to divide our country at a time when it desperately needs leadership that unifies it. It does not help Ukraine. It does not help Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. If the Prime Minister eschewed that approach, the Prime Minister eschewed this approach when he failed to table this agreement in Parliament 90 calendar days prior to the commencement of negotiations. In February of 2020, ahead of the renegotiation of the CUSMA agreement, the minister at the time made the following commitment: to require that a notice of intent to enter into negotiation towards a new free trade agreement be tabled in the House of Commons at least 90 calendar days prior to the commencement of negotiations. That didn't happen in this case. There was no collaborative effort. And again, I want to reemphasize that I will oppose the Liberal carbon tax. It does not help my constituents. It is not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is not meeting emissions targets. It is a flawed and failed policy. I will simultaneously stand here and support Putin while saying that anybody who is suggesting that we should be making politics over this is actually helping Putin. When I listen to this line of attack, it disgusts me because I know the people who are saying these things know better. And if they want to earn the votes of Canadians, they should be looking at the issues that are pushing their polls so far south, as opposed to desperately trying to cling to some sort of false narrative that only divides our country and only helps our country's enemies. It's disgusting, and it needs to stop. Seriously. Earlier today, the member for Glengarry Prescott Russell would not commit to asking his government to seize or to repurpose seized Russian assets. I'm not going to stand here and call him a Putin supporter. So no one on the other bench should suggest just because I firmly, strongly, backed by evidence, reject a carbon tax, that I somehow support that. That is exactly what the Russian war machine wants. That is the exact narrative that they want, and it needs to stop. At the same time, what this agreement should be doing is looking at ways to materially help our allies. Today, the leader of the Conservative Party, actually just moments ago, issued a press release saying that the Prime Minister must send CRV rockets to Ukraine. He's talking about ways that Canada should be sending surplus weapons to help our allies in their fight against Putin. That is a material way that we should be helping, not casting aspersions and trying to divide our country over this issue. The other thing that I want to, Madam Speaker, implore every member of this House as strongly as I can, I am going to read a small paragraph from a colleague in Ukraine, a note that she sent to me. The value of frozen Russian assets is estimated to be at least $320 billion. With no reasonable prospect for Russia paying compensation to Ukraine anytime soon, and Ukraine's need for both short and long-term financial assistance, confiscations of Russian assets becomes the only just and viable option, especially in view of the fact that up to $1 trillion will be needed for Ukraine to fully recover. Our partners, and this is from a Ukrainian MP, our partners' taxpayers should not shoulder the burden of Ukraine's recovery alone, especially as they froze and can use assets of aggressors responsible for the devastation. Madam Speaker, there are senior government officials in Ukraine today. Some of those senior government officials have suggested that in the past, that Canada's military is impotent. If they are going to take that posture, then at the very least, what Canada should be doing is using the laws that are already in place, that have already been supported by all members in this House, to repurpose seized Russian assets and lead a G7 charge to force Western allies to do exactly what Ukraine is crying out for in this case. Putin's war of aggression they need to compensate Ukraine. They are the aggressor. And at the very least, if Canada is true, and if Canada is going to try and make any sort of case that we are actually some sort of broker in the world, that we have any sort of relevancy, this is low-hanging fruit. We should be the first country to be doing this. We have the legal mechanisms. There is nothing in this agreement about that. Absolutely nothing. The government they have had this tool at their disposal for 2 years now, and they haven't moved on this. Am I going to accuse the government of not supporting Ukraine because of that? I could. Instead, I'd rather that they just move on it. This is an issue that transcends petty partisan politics and the desperate attempt of a prime minister who is 16 points behind in the polls to try to cling onto a disgusting life raft for his political gain. We have to work together. Our global democracy is at stake, folks. Right now, our allies are fighting a war that, like, we have lost the plot here, honestly. If somebody stands up, Madam Speaker, and dares question the fact that I will stand up for my constituents against a policy that does nothing to help them, that does nothing to help climate change, I have watched this debate. I have watched pundits. I have watched former colleagues say, well, you know, maybe the Conservatives should just capitulate on this. Absolutely not. It is the role of the government to build consensus during a time of crisis, and they failed to do that. So I beg them, do something that resembles work. Work with our partners to stop the funding of the Russian war machine by transporting more of Canada's natural gas overseas. That was that should have been in this agreement, but it's not. But at the very least, today, like, there's $300 billion. That's more than the entire sum total of all of the aid that's been sent to Ukraine. And Canada could be leading the charge on this. And instead, we have Liberal members of Parliament standing here and saying these things. They have lost the plot. They have lost the plot. And Canadians know this. Canadians aren't buying this. They're not buying this. So let's do better, Madam Speaker. I implore, I beg the government to rethink their posture, both on the carbon tax, on their political position on this issue, as well as dragging their feet on common sense measures that Conservatives have been calling for some time, that there's already consensus for in the House of Commons and across the country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. In every trade agreement, there's all sorts of compromises that are made. Sometimes you agree with something, sometimes you disagree with something. You take a look at the overall agreement in itself, and let there be no doubt when the President of Ukraine comes to Canada to sign an agreement that there was a consensus that was there. Even individuals like Brian Mulroney, a progressive Conservative, who had the Canada-US trade agreement. I'm sure that former Prime Minister, reflecting in terms of what the Conservative Party is today saying, is nothing but hogwash. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever outside of the MAGA conservative element coming from the United States into Canada that's actually driving the Conservative Party's position. This red herring that the members just finished talking about is wrong. It is about the MAGA right, Madam Speaker. My question is why will the Conservative Party not support this trade agreement?
Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Madam Speaker, standing up and using a loud, shouty voice does not negate the fact that the Liberals did not engage in a collaborative approach on this agreement. They did not table it in advance of the House of Commons. They did not try to seek consensus, and I oppose a carbon tax. A carbon tax, the Liberal carbon tax has brought Canada nowhere close to meeting its emissions targets. It's increasing the price of everything for everybody in our country at a time when most Canadians can't afford. They are choosing between food and rent. So yes, I oppose a carbon tax. Yes, I disagree with people, even of my own former political stripe, who suggest that we shouldn't. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm representing my constituents. I can do that and support strong action by Canada against the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Pierre-Boucher, les Patriotes.
The Honourable Member for Pierre-Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères. Ever since we started listening to the Conservatives on this bill, I've been struggling to follow. during the first version of the free trade agreement with Ukraine, the Conservatives brought it forward. And this new version is essentially just an update of the former version. There's nothing revolutionary in there. At a time when there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, so we might expect that all parliamentarians would show solidarity and say that it's time to support Ukraine in the face of the Russian invasion. It needs, even more than ever, to be able to trade with other countries. Now, the Conservatives love to oppose this on the basis of their infamous carbon tax. But if they were a government, would they really hold this kind of irresponsible remarks?
The Liberal carbon tax. It does not solve climate change, and it increases the cost of everything. And if the government wanted to remove, to have a consensus-based approach on this agreement, they would have removed it. It is unnecessary. It does not need to be in there. It's in there to be a political wedge, and I will stand up for my constituents. Now, to my colleague opposite, he needs to go talk to his constituents. They do not support a carbon tax either. They do not want to see an increased cost of living because of it. They are not worth the cost. A carbon tax is not worth the cost. We should be supporting Ukraine with measures like the Conservative leader announced today by sending surplus weapons. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not sure why the discussion, Madam Speaker, is focused on a carbon tax right now. When we're talking about this important issue, what I'm reflecting on is the conversations that I'm having with people who are arriving in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith fleeing war in Ukraine. A single mom and her child who are talking with me about the impacts of having to leave behind their families and all that they know in Ukraine. And I made a commitment to this now constituent to do all that I can to support Ukrainians at this time. And what I'm trying to understand is the leader of Ukraine asked for us to sign this agreement. I'm not going to pretend to know better than Ukrainians themselves and the leader of Ukraine how to best move forward. So why would we not support this agreement when the leader is asking us to do so?
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
The free trade agreement with Ukraine already exists. The NDP could be pressuring their coalition partners to release frozen assets to Ukraine. They're not doing that right now. That would immediately impact the people that she just talked about. But she should also be trying to lower the cost of living in Canada and fight for climate change by axing the carbon tax. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning on an issue that's very important to Canada, it's very important to Ukraine, and it's very important to the constituents in my riding of the Etobicoke Lakeshore. And of course, I am speaking about the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. We're not here debating carbon pricing.
Right.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I said, it is my honor to stand today in support of the legislation implementing the modernized free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. As was mentioned already, the modernization exercise for the CUFTA has not only allowed for the addition of new chapters, but has also provided an opportunity to update previously existing chapters of the agreement and to reflect the most recent practices in the field of international trade agreements. Important updates I would like to highlight right from the start are the updates made to the chapters on labor and the environment. The modernized provisions commit Canada and Ukraine to the highest standards on labor rights and environmental protection. These updates will help make the CUFTA a fully comprehensive modern trade agreement that levels the playing field while ensuring sufficient flexibility for parties to pursue crucial public policy objectives in these areas. Now, please allow me quickly, Madam Speaker, to give an overview of the 9 modernized chapters of the agreement. On the matter of rules of origin and origin procedures, Canada and Ukraine agreed to activate and operationalize the principle of cumulation of origin, which allow the materials originating in other countries than Canada and Ukraine both have free trade agreements with the count toward the originating status of goods exported under the agreement's tariff preferences. The result is that materials originating from, for example, the European Union, the European Free Trade Association members, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland, Israel, and the United Kingdom can take into consideration whether determining whether the final product qualifies as originating under the agreement and thus benefits from preferential treatment. Concretely, it gives producers greater flexibility in sourcing materials from countries with which Canada and Ukraine both have free trade agreements. Now on to digital trade, Madam Speaker. The new digital trade chapter of the Modernized Agreement is a significant update from the previous e-commerce chapter commitments to improve regulatory certainty for businesses seeking to engage in the digital economy in both markets, as well as those specifically looking to engage in cross-border digital trade between Canada and Ukraine. The chapter now contains ambitious commitments to facilitate the use of digital trade as a means of trade between Canada and Ukraine. The chapter includes commitments relating to cross-border data flows, data localization, source code disclosure, open government data, personal data protection. On this last item, it is worth noting that for the first time in any of Canada's trade agreements, a provision has been included prohibiting government authorities from using personal information collected from private organizations to discriminate against a person on grounds such as race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or political opinion. The Modernized Agreement now includes a standalone competition policy chapter with updated and new obligations to promote a competitive marketplace. The chapter furthers Canada and Ukraine's objectives towards a fair, transparent, predictable, and competitive business environment. This is notably done through enhanced obligations for competition authorities on procedural fairness and transparency, as well as new obligations for the identification and protection of confidential information. These new obligations provide assurance that fundamental principles, including the rights of defendants, are guaranteed during competition law investigations and enforcement proceedings. The Monopolies and State Enterprises chapter has also been upgraded to include important definitions for state-owned enterprises and designated monopolies and updated commitments on transparency and technical cooperation. In the Modernized Government Procurement chapter, Canada and Ukraine have clarified that they are allowed to take into account environmental, socioeconomic, or labor-related considerations in their procurement processes. This means it is now clear that the agreement does not prevent parties from adopting domestic policies and programs to support initiatives such as green and social procurement. The updated chapter also includes a new article to ensure integrity in procurement processes by committing parties to have criminal or administrative measures in place to address corruption in government procurement. Finally, the updated chapter also facilitates greater participation by Canadian and Ukrainian SMEs in government procurement. The upgraded labor chapter on the agreement is robust, comprehensive, and fully subject to the dispute settlement mechanism of the agreement. It aims to improve labor standards and working conditions in the two countries by building on international labor principles and rights. Two particularly notable articles were added: an important prohibition on goods made in whole or in part with forced labor, and a standalone article on violence against workers. This chapter confirms that Canada and Ukraine are fully committed to the highest labor rights standards and agree to cooperate fully in the field. The Modernized Environment chapter of CUFTA is the most comprehensive and ambitious ever achieved in Canadian free trade agreements. For the first time, the chapter includes provisions recognizing the importance of mutually supportive trade and climate change policies, including market-based approaches and trade-related climate measures to achieve green growth objectives. The Modernized chapter also introduces new articles to address key global environmental issues, such as plastic pollution and waste, and promotes trade of environmental goods and services in the circular economy. The chapter is reflective of Canada and Ukraine's leadership on trade and environment issues, and of our joint commitment to strengthen our cooperation in the area of long into the future. Lastly, the new transparency, anti-corruption, and responsible business conduct chapter significantly builds upon and improves the 2017 version. The chapter provides a framework for promoting transparency and integrity among public officials and the private sector while advancing enforceability of anti-corruption laws. Therefore, the new chapter furthers Canada and Ukraine's objective of an open and transparent international rules-based trading system that also promotes measures to prevent and respond to corruption. The chapter also includes a new section to encourage responsible business conduct per internationally recognized standards, guidelines, and principles. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I thank you for this opportunity to describe the significant improvements that were made to the existing chapters of the 2017 agreement through this modernization exercise. I believe I have made it clear that these upgrades will be instrumental in making the agreement a modern, fully comprehensive and responsive free trade agreement. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and happy to take questions.
Questions and comments. Question, the honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound. No, I'm sorry.
Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
Okay, Bruce Grey Owen Sound. I had it right.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. First, just a quick comment. We just had a transfer of leadership with the Canadian Armed Forces training mission, Joint Task Force Ukraine, just a few days ago, and I want to thank all the Canadian Armed Forces members that are part of that mission in training Ukrainians, in particular the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel James Boddy, who's the outgoing commander, and the new commander, Ben Rogerson. I had the pleasure to serve with both those gentlemen in Afghanistan. My question, though, to the Parliamentary Secretary is I asked on the 22nd of March 2022 about transferring surplus Canadian Armed Forces equipment to Ukraine, in particular Bison ambulances, because we have Ukrainian forces fighting right now on the ground and rescuing victims and injured soldiers in pickup trucks. Could the member, with his experience as Parliamentary Secretary, provide an update on what the government's doing to get that surplus CAF equipment to the Ukrainian Armed Forces?
There it is. Well done. Well done.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his question. I've had the pleasure of working with this member on a number of very important issues, and I have a lot of respect for his approach to politics, if I can put it that way, Madam Speaker. And I want to add my thanks to members of the Canadian military as well, because we all know the good work and the hard work and the effort they put in on our behalf. With respect to his question, I would be happy to speak with him offline on another occasion to provide him with all of the information that I can obtain. But I just want to re-emphasize. I mean, his question was in a positive tone, which is indicative of his approach to politics, in my experience. And I say that because we're here to support our ally and friend, Ukraine. And with one exception that I'm aware of, that's been raised by the official opposition, they support the agreement. So I would hope that he, with the approach that he takes to other issues, in my experience, would be willing to reconsider his position and encourage his colleagues in his caucus to reconsider theirs and vote with us so that we can unanimously support this agreement and get it passed, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this agreement, we have to get it signed now so that Canada will be ready to help Ukraine once this Russian illegal war on Ukraine ends. Russia, Ukraine's infrastructure, all sectors of economy has been destroyed, and Ukraine needs Canada's help in that respect. About $400 billion needs to be invested, and Canadian businesses have got the expertise in helping Ukraine in all these matters. I would like to ask the honourable member what his constituents feel about the need of this agreement now.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. Look, I spent, like everybody did, time in their constituencies over Christmas and in January. I'm very fortunate that I have a large Ukrainian constituency, a community that I have known and worked with since I was a child. And over the holidays, I attended many functions. I spoke with community leaders. I spoke with business leaders. I spoke with people who are approaching me and trying to find ways to work with government and politicians from all parties on how to get this agreement passed. But yes, when we get past the agreement, how we can work collectively towards rebuilding Ukraine. One thing that was consistent with every single conversation I had, everybody in the Ukrainian community I spoke with, why is this happening? Why is there not unanimous support for this agreement? How do we get past this? And I said, I share your concern. I'm working towards achieving that goal. People who know me know I'm not a particularly partisan guy. I believe that there's certain issues that are of such importance that partisan politics should have no part in them, and this is one of them. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Joliette.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech, although I'm not as pleased with his vote yesterday at committee against bilingualism. And now I'd like to ask about the only amendment that was adopted to this bill at committee, having to do with a section brought forward by my colleague for Saint-Hyacinthe. This section would ensure that the minister must constantly review the behavior of Canadian businesses in Ukraine and table an annual report. In section 15.14 of the agreement, that section seeks to lay out best practices, for example, in fighting corruption. Thank you.
To the extent I could hear him in my earpiece, Madam Speaker, again, I'm happy to sit down with the member afterwards and work through this and talk about the concerns he's raised and see if we can find a compromise and a solution. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Hey, come on. Please. No, the question.
Madam Speaker,
Oh.
I think there's someone still.
Oh, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I guess my question is this. We've had trade agreements, more than 50 that have been signed that have never contained any clausing at all about carbon pricing. Ukraine already has a carbon price. I don't know why we would put equal carbon pricing and protection against carbon leakage and all this kind of stuff into this contract. This is exactly what they don't need. So why will the Liberals not just take that out and then we can unanimously support this trade agreement?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The short answer is because they want it in there. I don't know what else there is to say to answer that question. I have spoken with members of the Ukrainian Parliament. I have spoken with members of the Ukrainian community. I was here when President Zelensky, I was in the room when he signed the agreement. They want it in the agreement. It's as simple as that. An agreement is something that's negotiated between two parties and reaching a consensus, and this is what was done here. They want it there. That's why. Hear, hear.
Questions and comments? Debate? Is the House ready for the question? La question est la suivante.
The question is as follows. Ms. Ng, seconded by Ms. Anand, moves that Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine, be now read a third time and do pass.
Mr. Seaback, seconded by Mr. Jean, has moved the following amendment. That the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine, be not now read a third time, but be referred to the Standing Committee on International Trade with the view to amend the coming into force provision to allow it to be fixed by order of the Governor and Council after the removal of all references to carbon pricing and carbon leakage. Si un député participant en personne.
If a member participating in person wishes that the amendment be carried or carried on division, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We would request a recorded vote, please.
Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, February 5th, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions. Statements by members. Déclaration des députés. The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
In my riding of North Island Powell River, days before Christmas, with no notice, over 300 employees were told that the Myra Falls mine was shutting down. I have sat down with Unifor Local 3019, who are working hard with all levels of government to protect their workers. Their ask of me was simple. When will the rules finally be fixed in Canada to protect workers' pensions and local small businesses in our community when big projects shut down? Well, Madam Speaker, we know that the Bloc and the NDP pushed very hard to get Bill C-228 through this place last year, and in fact, it received royal assent in April of last year. So where are the regulations? Where is the government at finally making workers a priority in this country? When will we see workers and their pensions at the top of the list instead of at the bottom? Workers in Canada don't deserve this. Our small communities have seen these boom and bust cycles again and again. The workers in the local communities bear the weight of it. It is time that they were protected. Get the regulations in place now.
The Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. After 8 years of these Liberals, my home province of British Columbia is facing a housing affordability crisis, and that is impacting economic development as workers are frozen out of the real estate market. And the Liberals' housing announcements in the fall economic statement is nothing more than empty words. Josh, who lives not too far from me, told me our mortgage payment has doubled over a single year from about $3,000 a month to $5,800 a month due to these Liberals spending like drunken sailors. Another neighbor says that her family has to leave the province since they cannot find an affordable home. Conservatives will build the homes, fix the budget, bring down inflation and mortgage rates, and bring home prosperity for all our citizens. Let's bring it home.
The Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Madam Speaker, my community is excited to celebrate Black History Month with over 20 events across Windsor-Essex honoring the proud history and culture of one of the oldest and most dynamic Black communities in Canada. Celebrations began with a book launch spotlighting the late Dr. Howard McCurdy, Black activist, Black scientist, Black icon, who served our community with distinction as the second Black Member of Parliament in Canada. 2 concerts by the Windsor Symphony Orchestra at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum in partnership with River Bookshop. Lana Talbot is hosting an exhibit at the John Muir branch of the Windsor Public Library. Step into Sandwich First Baptist Church, the oldest active Black church in Canada. Download the Crossroads digital pass from Tourism Windsor-Essex to trace the steps of the Underground Railroad and take in the delicious Caribbean flavors of Freedom Annual Black History Brunch, organized by the Windsor West Indian Association. To all Black home, I wish a happy Black History Month. Thank you.
Good job. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Grisba.
Extreme far-right populism is targeting trans children's rights across provinces in order to divide and distract from the housing crisis, the opioid crisis, and to ultimately weaken our democracy. Punching down like this is the worst form of politics. We must have the courage to stand with the trans and gender diverse community and commit to not allowing for the continuation of anti-trans violence. It is up to us to find paths forward and to fulfill recommendations made by our white paper on trans rights. The government has a moral and legal obligation to uphold the rights of trans and two-spirit people. Madam Speaker, the closet came to Canada when colonization came. I now want to speak directly to gender diverse, two-spirit, and trans kids who are feeling scared in Canada. You are loved, you belong, and we will not allow bigotry to diminish the incredible work of so many trans kids and their allies. To the teachers, parents, and communities who are doing the hard work of support for children, thank you.
The Honourable Member for Brampton East.
Madam Speaker, I recently sat down with the Brampton Board of Trade, Beehive, and the Brampton Economic Development Team to discuss the important work our government is doing to promote trade and economic development. Through our Indo-Pacific strategy, CanExport, EDC, and our Trade Commissioner services, which provide support to Canadian businesses across our network of missions around the world. I had the opportunity to meet with Brampton entrepreneurs and industry leaders to hear about their successes and how the trade agreements our government signed enable them to expand and explore new international markets. Brampton is a leader in economic growth. MDA Aerospace, Magna International, Coca-Cola, Pet Value, Lululemon, to name a few, all expanding to Brampton, creating thousands of jobs in our city. Madam Speaker, as we take on 2024, I am committed to building on this momentum with a continued focus on attracting record investments, enabling growth through trade, and ensuring the residents of Brampton have every opportunity to succeed here in our country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Bow River.
Thank you. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians are struggling. Their housing plan doesn't build houses. Rural communities like Acme and Bazzano and Bow River are left behind. But Conservatives will build homes, not bureaucracy, by cutting red tape. Violent crime up, rural crime up, car theft up, but Conservatives will introduce jail, not bail, for repeat violent offenders and keep our streets safe. Mortgages up, food prices up, food bank use up, but Conservatives will fix the budget, stop this out-of-control, inflationary-causing spending. Farmers like Rob feed Canadians that are paying $15,000 in carbon tax to heat his barn. If they quadruple it, that's $60,000 in carbon tax. But Conservatives will axe the tax to bring home lower prices. NDP Liberals are just not worth the cost. We will build the homes, fix the budget, stop the crime, and axe the tax.
The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Madam Speaker, only when acknowledging the Black Canadian history as Canadian history can we truly understand and celebrate the rich and diverse heritage of our nation. That's why this year's theme, Black Excellence, a heritage to celebrate, a future to build, reminds us of the contributions, struggles, and achievements of Black Canadians while challenging us to build a more inclusive and equitable Canada. Canada's history is marked by the contributions of great ones like Lincoln Alexander, Viola Desmond, and the No. 2 Construction Battalion. They inspire today's change makers like Jean Augustine, Rosemary Sadler, Patricia and Moses Moa, and Vaughan's very own Shernette Martin, who are strengthening our social fabric. Our government is working with Black community leaders to ensure Black voices are heard and reflected in policies. We are delivering initiatives that empower Black Canadians, including the Black Entrepreneurship Loan Fund and the Multicultural and Anti-Racism Program. Together, we are removing systemic barriers and ensuring Black Canadians can fulfill their potential. Madam Speaker, happy Black History Month.
Thank you.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Madam Speaker, Black Canadian history is Canadian history. The theme for this Black History Month 2024 is Black Excellence, a heritage to celebrate, a future to build. I would like to acknowledge the contributions that Black Canadians have made and continue to make to Canadian society. I recognize the critical role that countless Black trailblazers, past and present, have played in shaping Canada into the country it is today, and thank them for it. My focus has been building the future through economic empowerment of Black Canadians. The federal government has initiated programs to support Black entrepreneurship. In November, I hosted part of Canada-Africa Business Summit on Parliament Hill and participated in a panel discussion on impact of Afro-descendants diaspora on the Canadian and African economy. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Madam Speaker, today is a Groundhog Day, but it doesn't matter if the groundhog sees his shadow. With the Liberals in power, it is always winter. It's like that old Bill Murray movie. For 8 years, we have seen stuck in a perpetual Groundhog Day. Nothing changes except taxes go up, food prices go up, housing costs go up, and crimes goes up. Every day Canadians discover that the Liberal NDP government is a failure and the Prime Minister isn't worth the cost. Groundhog Day reminds us that the long Liberal winter will be over soon. On this Groundhog Day, Canadians know that spring is indeed coming, and within its new Conservative government that will axe the tax, build homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for London North Centre.
Madam Speaker, every member of Parliament recognizes that the first honour of this job is the honour of representing your community and those who make it up. Along the way, we meet tremendous people, and one of those was Tom Hennessy, who recently passed away at 101. He served multiple campaigns in World War II as a fighter pilot. Later, he continued to give back to our community by becoming a physical education teacher. In 2022, Madam Speaker, where I first met Tom, he finished his walk of gratitude. That's a walk of 100 miles in support of injured veterans. It shows, Mr. Speaker, his example rather shows, that our democracy does not happen by accident. It rests on the shoulders of those who came before us. His efforts and those of other veterans have secured our democracy. We can exist in this House of Commons and debate the issues of the day because of people like Tom. To his family and friends, my deepest condolences. It was an honour to know Tom Hennessy, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, the cost of rent has doubled and housing simply isn't affordable, if you can even find a house or an apartment to rent. Canadians are being forced to choose between eating and heating and paying their rent. Yet the Prime Minister doesn't think housing is a federal responsibility. And his housing minister thinks you can live in a photo op. Meanwhile, the Liberals got fewer houses built last year than in 1972. Only common sense Conservatives have a plan to build more homes instead of more bureaucracy. We will reward municipalities that build more houses and remove the barriers that hinder construction. The choice is clear: a Prime Minister who's not worth the cost, or common sense Conservatives who will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime.
The
Honourable Member for Beauce. Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this Prime Minister, Canadians have never been in such dire straits. 2 million Canadians per month are forced to go to food banks just to be able to feed their families. On April 1st, this situation will only get worse when the Liberals hike the carbon tax again, showing once again how out of touch with reality they are. Only the Conservative Party stands up for Canadians, while the NDP and the Bloc support the government in opposing this punitive measure across the country. The Bloc continues to mislead Quebecers that the carbon tax doesn't affect them. But they're wrong. The second carbon tax affects us directly at the pump by adding 20 cents a litre to the price of gas, while the first carbon tax continues to affect the price of every item shipped to Quebec. The Conservative Party of Canada wants to take care of the country as a whole. We continue to fight the government until this tax and the rest of its inflationary policies are eliminated. Let's let common sense prevail and vote for a Conservative government. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's Black History Month, and the contribution of Black Canadians to our history is invaluable. We owe a great debt to these individuals. It's the opportunity to recognize those who have made a difference in our communities. So therefore, I take advantage of this opportunity to thank and pay tribute to Luc Termonville, an entrepreneur here in my riding. He is the CEO of the Ottawa-Gatineau Black Entrepreneurs and Professionals Association, board member of the Regroupement des gens d'affaires of the National Capital Region, and community representative of CHUO 89.1 FM. He works tirelessly to develop Black businesses and entrepreneurs. Luc has also created made efforts to promote young Canadians, giving them the necessary tools to make entrepreneurs successful. Thank you.
For Victoria.
Madam Speaker, the same day the International Court of Justice ruled measures are needed to prevent genocide in Gaza, the Liberals cut off funding to UNRWA. This is the UN agency providing relief to Palestinian refugees. It is the only organization of its size positioned to provide food and aid to civilians caught in this horrific conflict. New Democrats support an investigation into their 12 former staff, but defunding UNRWA and cutting off millions of innocent Palestinians from their only lifeline, it is collective punishment. It is cruel and it is illegal. 2 million civilians, over half of whom are children, rely on UNRWA and are facing starvation, famine, and continued indiscriminate bombing. The International Court of Justice ordered immediate and effective action to ensure the provision of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Canada must reverse these cuts. To my Liberal colleagues, why have you abandoned human rights, abandoned international law? How can you punish over 1 million innocent children?
The Honourable Member for Shefford. At the end of 2023, I had the opportunity to celebrate the 55th anniversary of an organization with a crucial mission for Granby, the Granby Association for Intellectual Disabilities and Autism, better known as the AGDIA. It was an opportunity to hear touching testimonials from parents and people living with these realities. Over the years, AGDIA has certainly helped to break down barriers and taboos about the various autism spectrums. We've come a long way in the past 55 years, but there are still too many challenges and prejudices in society. Yet a person with special needs is an integral part of today's society. Thanks to organizations like this one, they can now take part in activities, discover passions, socialize, and even work. And for parents, it's a moment of respite when they know that their child is in good hands. Bravo to the General Director of this whole team for the successful event and for all their hard work. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Souris West Mountain.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, Canadians can no longer afford to pay the price of this Prime Minister's incompetence.
His carbon tax is set to increase yet again on April 1st. And guess who's going to have to pay for it? It will be the farmer who works tirelessly from sun up to sundown to put food on our tables. It'll be the parents who have to choose between keeping the heat on or feeding their children. It'll be the small business owner who has to lay off staff to pay their bills. It will be the local community center who has to cut programming because the carbon tax has doubled their monthly expenditures. Meanwhile, the Liberals are raking in almost $500 million of revenue in GST on this carbon tax alone, while Canadians struggle to pay for the most basic of life's necessities. With his reckless spending and unwillingness to help those in need, it is clear that this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. It is time for a new government that works for those who do the work, who will axe the tax for everyone for good.
The honourable member for Niagara Centre.
Madam Speaker, today we pay tribute to Bob Lamb, who is today enjoying his first day of retirement from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. After a long and successful career with the Coast Guard and the DFO, culminating as the Regional Director General for the Central and Arctic region, Bob felt the further pull of public service. In 2013, he joined the Commission as Executive Secretary, where he worked tirelessly to improve the organization in ways that positioned it to help protect the Great Lakes and to sustain the world-class fisheries found right here in the province of Ontario. Bob's time with the Commission brought tremendous change as well as improvement to this binational organization. He delivered reliability and sound management and improved the way the Commission and governments interface, something that has been universally positive for the Great Lakes. Bob Lamb has been a once-in-a-generation change-maker, and on behalf of all Canadians, I thank him for his service. Thank you, Bob. Enjoy the next wonderful stage in your life with Linda and your family. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Madam Speaker, Quebec is just on the other side of the Outaouais River, specifically the city of Gatineau. After 8 years under this Prime Minister, Gatineau is hurting the most from these soft-on-crime Liberal policies. Violent gun crime has increased by 76% in just 1 year. That's the biggest increase than anywhere else in Quebec. There were 14,000 violent gun crimes committed in 2022. That's the highest number in 15 years. When will the Prime Minister finally end the at-home Netflix sentences and stop crime? The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House. Madam Speaker, I'm the proud member for Gatineau, and I can say that the Conservative policies are ones that will contribute to violence in our communities. If we keep guns, the measures that they firmly opposed under the 8 years of this government, they are voting against any measures to give the tools needed to our police forces in Gatineau and elsewhere across the country. They vote against all those measures, which will help crime rates drop. We are here. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. I don't see how, after 8 years of Liberal inaction, the member for Gatineau can be proud that violent crime using guns has increased by 76% in Gatineau. But it's not just gun crime. The housing crisis is also continuing to get much worse. The situation will continue to get worse. More people will be forced out of their homes. And in fact, everything is related. After 8 years under this government, it's a disaster when it comes to housing. The Bloc is not an alternative. They want to keep this Prime Minister in place for another 2 years. When will the Prime Minister stop adding bureaucracy and start building homes?
Terry.
Yes, it's true, Madam Speaker. There is a housing crisis in our country. But what is the best approach? It's the approach our government has taken.
Certainly this fall, but certainly throughout our tenure in government. Letting more homes be built in this country, putting in place serious measures to work with municipalities. In fact, we have an agreement with the province of Quebec that will lead to thousands of more homes being built. This is the Housing Accelerator Fund, Madam Speaker. Throughout the country, we see that as well. It's an approach that incents more building, all types of building. The Conservatives want to tax building, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. There are waiting lines for houses after 8 years under this Prime Minister. He's not worth the wait at all. There's waiting lines in airports for passports, hours on the phone for an EI check. There are even waiting lists for food banks. And the Bouchers Généreuses in Quebec said it's not normal that in a modern and rich society such as ours, families with 2 working parents have to go to a food bank. Will the costly Bloc Liberal coalition support our common sense motion to cancel the April 1st tax hike? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, they say they have the backs of Canadians. I think it's interesting and hypocritical for them to point arguments like that out time and again. What did we learn yesterday? We learned that the chief advisor to the opposition leader has served as the chief lobbyist of Galen Weston and Loblaws. And today we learned something else. The opposition leader ought to get in touch with his deputy leader, who served as a lobbyist for Walmart, the grocery conglomerate. They want to talk about competition in the grocery sector. They vote against it every time. It's no surprise.
You can't make it.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I can assure you, Madam Speaker, unlike these Liberals, if Ms. Byrne had hauled the grocers in for a roundtable, prices would be lower by now. The reality is that the Liberal NDP coalition have nobody outside of themselves to blame for high grocery prices because of increased tax and deficit spending. This inflationary crisis is their causing. So, a simple question. Will they support our motion to cancel the increase in the carbon tax on April the 1st?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, what we see today is an illustration of the hypocrisy of this Conservative Party. Their deputy leader lobbying behind the scenes, behind the curtain, for Walmart, of all people, one of the major players in our grocery sector, and their grand poobah, the person to whom they all must pay absolute homage, is, it turns out, as we speak, her firm getting a paycheck from Loblaws as we debate competition in this chamber and as the Conservatives vote against every measure.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
It's really spectacular to see what these Liberals will do, knowing how far behind they are in the polls. The reality is that they are behind in the polls because they're not helping Canadians make ends meet. They're making it worse for them. What we need to do is axe the carbon tax. We need to build more homes. There is a motion in front of Parliament that would make life more affordable right now for Canadians. Will the government support our common sense motion to stop the carbon tax increase on April the 1st?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Madam Speaker, an economist from the University of Calgary specifically found that if the carbon price and the carbon rebates that are sent to Canadians was cancelled tomorrow, the people who would most benefit earn more than $250,000. If we're concerned about affordability, here on this side of the House, we're looking out for the everyday Canadians. On that side of the House, they seem to be looking out for the top 1%.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-Sorois. Madam Speaker, once again, French is being treated like a second-class language in this Parliament. Yesterday, the Conservatives and the NDP, with the support of a lost Liberal, decided in committee that commissioners looking at potential miscarriages of justice don't need to be bilingual. Once again, these parties are abandoning francophones in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. The justice is supposed to be bilingual. Canada is also supposed to be bilingual. Will the government ensure that miscarriage of justice commissioners are indeed bilingual?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm the so-called lost Liberal she's referring to. I was at that committee, I voted the way I did, and I'm proud I did. I stood up for unilingual French-speaking citizens in the province of Quebec. I stood up for English speakers and minorities across the country, British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. That commission is going to be bilingual in nature. It's going to be available for people in both official languages, and that's the most important thing in that bill. I think what was decided yesterday was absolutely right and stands for exactly the principle she is advancing.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-Sorois. Madam Speaker, It's terrible what we've just heard. Once again, this Parliament is devaluing Francophones on the pretext of promoting diversity. Let me repeat that. French is not an obstacle to diversity. French in this country is part of its diversity, and the Francophonie is diverse. That is a very weak argument when we talk about justice, because the two official languages are equally lawful. Anyone who does not understand French is not competent to interpret law in Canada. Will the parties explain to their colleagues that, or who will explain that these make no sense? The Honourable Government House Leader. I can assure the member and all parliamentarians in the House that this government is dedicated and committed and has full respect for the Official Languages Act in all areas of federal jurisdiction, including the administration of justice. The member can be fully reassured that French is well alive as long as this government remains in power.
For North Island Powell River.
Speaker, toxic drug overdoses have devastated countless communities like in my riding. Campbell River just witnessed the worst year on record for toxic drug-related deaths, having the 5th highest rate of deaths in British Columbia. People need a plan and a federal government willing to act. But the Liberals drag their feet and offer up patchwork plans, while the Conservatives try to criminalize our loved ones who are struggling. Canada needs a health-based plan for harm reduction and treatment with a timeline. What's the holdup?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for the question. And I agree. We agree with the member that when it comes to issues around substance issues, addiction, we need to bring a thoughtful healthcare approach to that. And that is why we continue to work with the provinces in making sure that we're bringing in a healthcare approach to people who are facing mental health and addiction challenges, so that we can look after them, unlike what the Conservative wants to do, which is to throw these people into jails and treat them not like humans, but just as criminals, which is absolutely wrong.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Madam Speaker, people who took CERB in good faith are now being punished by this government. While everyday Canadians are struggling to pay for food or rent, the Liberals have decided to punish them by clawing back low-income benefits in an effort to recoup CERB money Canadians desperately needed to survive. Clawing back benefits from people who already can't make ends meet is cruel. Why are the Liberals going after families struggling to put food on the table while giving wealthy CEOs a free ride?
Good question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, we have been clear from the outset, if a situation of repayment arose, we would treat all cases individually and fairly. We were also clear that we would show flexibility and recover overpayments without any interest or any penalties. To prevent undue hardship, flexible repayment options are available. Individuals can establish repayment schedules based on their financial situation and their ability to pay. Madam Speaker, we will continue to take a responsible approach to ensure a fair process. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer Mountain View.
After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, farmers and consumers know that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Increasing the carbon tax only increases the cost of goods in stores, and for those farmers that cannot pass on the exorbitant carbon tax, it destroys their bottom line. Will the Liberals reject the Senate's amendments and restore Bill C-234 to its original state, removing the carbon tax on farmers and lowering the price of food for Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Conservatives love to talk the talk with farmers, but when it comes time for action, they're always missing inaction. Every time they were in power, they slashed the funding for farmers, something they don't like to talk about. They slashed $200 million for farmers, money that was directed to farmers. On this side of the House, we added 25% more dollars in our agreement with province, money that's going directly to farmers. And as the Honourable Member knows, there's a partial rebate available for the issue that he's raised.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer Mountain View.
Well, Madam Speaker, these ministers must do a lot more than just mouth Greta's catchphrases. Grain commodity prices have dropped 20 to 40% in the last few months. Localized drought and flooding always takes its toll, but the price drop is because prairie farmers have had one of the best yielding crops ever. But there's no more profit. Suppliers, banks, and governments are the only winners. Quadrupling the carbon tax on farmers' inputs will be devastating. Will the Liberals stop playing games and give farmers the break they need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we're not playing games, and I wish he'd stop misinforming this House. Obviously, farmers have faced droughts. We get that. We understand. Why? Because of climate change. 21% of grains in 2021 didn't make it to the market. And there's programs in place like agri-stability. I hope the member is lobbying extremely hard to the member of the official opposition to make him understand that slashing agri-stability while he was at the cabinet table was not a good issue for farmers. It was not a good policy for farmers. On this side of the House, we're supporting farmers. We're putting more money in their pockets, and we're making sure that programs, when they face droughts, are available for them.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Madam Speaker, it's common sense. When you tax farmers for having to dry their grain or heat their barn, you're making it much more expensive to produce the food we all eat. Jim, a poultry farmer from my riding, is paying $5,000 a month in carbon taxes to heat his barn. This Prime Minister always thinks he knows best. He thinks that food just teleports to grocery stores, that it magically appears on plates, and he even thinks he can run Jim's farm better than he can. How much more does he suggest Jim should be paying to heat his barn when it's 40 below?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I'm always happy to rise to answer a question on farming, especially I'm glad the member raises supply management. Our government has supported supply management throughout its mandate. For 8 years, we have supported supply management. $4.5 billion are available for supply managed farmers. And obviously, the member raises an important question. We understand that climate change has a huge impact on the availability of land and the crops. It has a huge impact on the profitability of farmers. We just hope that the member can lobby his leader of the official opposition to make sure that he doesn't slash budgets that are available.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
I wish we could spread answers like that on farmers' fields so that at least they could benefit from some of that fertilizer. This NDP Liberal government is costing Canadians through high food prices, once again showing how out of touch they are. Not only did the radical Environment Minister admit to pressuring senators to gut Bill C-234, but farmers are getting another carbon tax on April 1st. After 8 years, this Prime Minister has proven that he is most certainly not worth the cost. Will the Liberals reject the Senate's amendments and completely remove the carbon tax from farmers to lower food prices for Canadians?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The member is an associate member of the Finance Committee. Yesterday, the Governor of the Bank of Canada appeared there, Madam Speaker, and made clear that carbon pricing is not a fundamental factor in inflation. But you know what is important, Madam Speaker? What is important is the fact that we have to get behind the idea of competition. This government has put forward a measure that would advance competition in the grocery sector, and we know why they don't support it. Their chief advisors on the side of Loblaws, that party's in the pocket of Loblaws, they're in the pocket of Walmart, it seems. Their deputy leader has been a lobbyist for them. They don't believe in competition in the grocery sector. They don't believe in Canadians, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Madam Speaker, Bill C-234 is back in the House after Liberal-appointed senators stalled and gutted this crucial legislation. This bill is vital for exempting farmers from the carbon tax and would ease the high cost of Canadian food. But as the carbon tax is set to quadruple, farmers will pay $1 billion by 2030 and will push food prices even higher. Will the Liberals scrap the Senate amendments, remove the carbon tax from agriculture, and make food more affordable for everyone?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, we know that farmers actually see the brunt of climate change and natural disasters day to day. And that is what is increasing food prices when we see how they are being impacted by natural disasters. We are actually taking action to fight climate change and at the same time support farmers. In each instance where we were supporting farmers in the last votes, the Conservatives voted against. They voted against $25 million going to Fort McMurray Cold Lake to support agricultural workers in that field. Why are they standing against supporting farmers to fight climate change?
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
With an answer like that, I'm not surprised Canadians can't afford food in a country where 2 million citizens are relying on food banks monthly. It's baffling to see the NDP Liberal coalition push to quadruple the carbon tax. When you tax the farmer that grows the food and the trucker who delivers the food, Canadians are stuck with higher food prices. Bill C-234 in its original form promises immediate relief. Will the Liberals discard the Senate's alterations, lift this tax burden, and help Canadians afford their groceries already?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the first thing that the Conservatives did when the last time they formed government was to get rid of childcare right across our country. That impacts affordability. We have a national childcare program that's reducing the cost of childcare to $10 a day. They were sending $100 checks to millionaires. We brought in Canada Child Benefit that gives up to $619 a month to the people who need it the most. In each instance, we're there to support families to put food on the table. They are not.
Worst possible thing.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Madam Speaker, the January 18th deadline to repay the CEBA loans without penalties shows the federal government's lack of consideration for entrepreneurs. The Liberals even celebrated this week the fact that 80% of small businesses paid the money back on time. This means, according to their calculations, that 20% are unable to repay the loan. 1 in 5 small businesses who took out the CEBA loan is at risk of going bankrupt, and the Liberals think that that is good news. Do the Liberals think that 180,000 bankruptcies is a good news story? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Once again, we are here in a number of ways for small businesses. Yes, the CEBA was very important during COVID. We extended the loan period, the loan itself, and there was a non-refundable amount. 80% of those who took out the loan have already repaid it. There are other measures to repay the loan. There are 3 years, and it's 5% interest. There's a lot of other measures, and I would say that if we didn't have this subsidy for wages, then a lot of businesses would have gone bankrupt. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Madam Speaker, while the Liberals are patting themselves on the back, they are ignoring the sacrifices made by those who made the reimbursement. There are people who dangerously drew on their lines of credit. They put their own homes on the line, all because Ottawa is refusing to assess case by case. They're refusing to guarantee loans with financial institutions because they're stubbornly adding $20,000 in debt to companies already on the verge of the abyss. Would it hurt so much to show consideration and flexibility for our businesses? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Once again, thank you, Madam Speaker. During COVID, had we not been there with CEBA and the wage subsidy, with the rent assistance, thousands of small businesses would not have made it through the pandemic. The economy is recovering. We have very reasonable conditions in place for repayment. 80% have already repaid. They have until the end of March still. And for those that will have to extend by 3 years, it's only 5% interest that will be paid. So $250 maximum a month. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Central Okanagan, Similkanin Nicola.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, so many of my residents struggle to pay for gas and groceries, particularly seniors on fixed income, single parents, persons with disabilities. We can fight this made-in-Canada inflation by supporting the Conservative leader's motion to cancel the April 1st carbon tax increase. Will the Liberal and NDP caucus members vote to stop this increase to help struggling Canadians, or will the Prime Minister simply whip the ball?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, it seems the Conservatives have some explaining to do while they're taking acting classes, talking about the plight and affordability of Canadians. The official leader of the opposition's chief strategist is getting rich off of the backs of Loblaws as a lobbyist. And, Madam Speaker, I think we now know while the Conservatives act for their videos and clips, yet they're voting against Canadians' interests and affordability and competition for grocery prices. Madam Speaker, while they take acting classes, we're acting.
The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkanin Nicholas.
The only one that's acting here is us on this side being responsible and saying what our constituents are feeling. Now, the Prime Minister recognized the pain his carbon tax caused and exempted home heating oil from it last fall. But this didn't occur in my home province. The BC government said that they wanted a similar exemption for home heating oil from this NDP Liberal government to their climate plan. I support the Conservative leader's common sense plan to axe the tax for all Canadians, Madam Speaker, but at very least British Columbia should be treated fairly. If BC requests it, will the Prime Minister approve their request?
Here, here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Madam Speaker, British Columbia has been a leader in fighting climate change. In fact, they brought a price on carbon pollution before the federal government did, and they have been a true partner all throughout every step. We will continue to work with the province of British Columbia to make sure that they can support Canadians. They have the Greener Homes grants and other programs where we continue to support every measure that Canadians do to have cleaner fuel. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Confederation.
Madam Speaker, a tax on a farmer is a tax on food. It's that simple. Canadians know rising carbon taxes make everything more expensive, and they overwhelmingly know that after 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. Conservatives know a carbon tax hike on April 1st will make food even more unaffordable. That is why we put forward a sensible motion to cancel this tax hike. Do the Liberals even know that their carbon tax hike will continue to drive up the cost of food?
Here, here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a bit funny that the members are talking about affordability on that side. I think my honourable colleague has brought a good point. The chief strategist for the Leader of the Official Opposition is a lobbyist for Loblaws. Loblaws is the only grocer asking to not be part of the Grocery Code of Conduct, something that the Conservatives were supportive. They were supportive of the Grocery Code of Conduct. Now I'm asking, is this an official policy of the Conservative Party of Canada that they're no longer supporting the Grocery Code of Conduct because their chief strategist is the lobbyist for Loblaws?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Confederation.
Madam Speaker, this government just doesn't understand how badly Canadians are struggling, including my city of Calgary. Statistics Canada recently reported that it costs more to afford basic goods and live a moderate standard of living in Calgary than any other major city in Canada. It now costs more to live in Calgary than it does in Toronto or Vancouver. Will the Liberals stop their April 1st carbon tax increase that will make gas, groceries, and home heating even more expensive, or will they pile on more costs to Calgarians?
Here, here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We have worked, as you know, Madam Speaker, with the City of Calgary on a range of matters, including getting more housing built through the Housing Accelerator Fund. But I find the hypocrisy in the Conservative position stunning. They continue to talk about the vulnerable, where we know what they would do if they were in office. They would cut pensions, they would cut EI. The Canada Child Benefit, it would be cut. Dental care, child care, they've never been for it, Madam Speaker. They talk about the homelessness. Be serious, Madam Speaker. They don't believe in dealing with homelessness because every time they've had a chance to vote for measures that would deal with it, they voted against it as recently as a few weeks ago. They're not serious, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Grisba.
Gaza is the most dangerous place to be a journalist. 122 journalists have been killed in Netanyahu's onslaught. Mansour Schumann, a brave reporter in Gaza, a Canadian and a fellow Albertan, has been missing for over a week. Eyewitnesses say he is taken into custody by the Israeli army. His mother is worried sick and says the government hasn't done enough to keep her informed about his whereabouts. Can the government commit to Mansour Schumann's mother and all his loved ones that they will do everything in their power to bring him home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank the Honourable Member for raising this issue today and for many members who have sent me concerns about this particular case. When it comes to this case, I want to state very clearly that consular officials at Global Affairs, as well as in the field, have been in touch with the family. The Minister herself talked to the family this week and have assured the family that we are doing everything we can to find out this person's whereabouts. We are considering every possibility of engagement on this case. We will continue to do that. I'm not able to go into further details due to privacy concerns, but if you have more concerns or questions, please contact me directly. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Madam Speaker, Canadians can't keep up with their home heating costs. Switching to a heat pump makes life more affordable while tackling the climate crisis. But the current Liberal program is riddled with problems and almost impossible for rural and lower-income Canadians to access. The Liberals have threatened to cancel this program and are leaving people out in the cold with higher home heating bills and no option to switch. This makes no sense. Why won't the Liberals make Big Oil pay what they owe and use the funds to fix the heat pump program?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, it is an absolutely amazing thing to see how popular the Greener Homes Grant has been, as well as the Greener Homes loans. Canadians across the country have been taking this opportunity to better insulate their home and switch to heat pumps, all of which reduces their bills, their heat bills at the end of the day, at the same time as protecting our environment. We have a continued commitment to work towards green buildings right across our country. We will be having an update soon. Please watch for it.
The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, earlier this week I had the pleasure of joining the Ministers of Justice and Public Safety in York Region to announce $121 million in funding to combat guns, gangs and organised crime in Ontario. In the City of Vaughan and in many big cities across the country, auto theft is a growing problem and one that's becoming increasingly violent. Can the Minister of Public Safety please reassure my constituents and all Canadians and tell us how the government plans to tackle this issue? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for Vaughan Woodbridge for standing up for safety in his community and joining the Minister of Public Safety to address auto theft, which is a serious problem that requires collaboration and an all-hands-on-deck approach with our provincial and municipal partners. Canadians are understandably concerned for their safety, and they expect elected officials to put their partisanship aside and work together. That's why our government is working with local partners, including the police, while the Leader of the Opposition insults the individuals who have taken an oath.
The Honourable Member for Parry Sound Muskoka.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, the doom and gloom in the housing market is worse than ever. Fewer homes were built last year than the year before. Vacancy rates are at all-time highs, or all-time lows rather, and rent is at all-time high. Instead of removing the gatekeepers that block buildings, the Liberals cut them big checks. In fact, the first 4 photo ops this housing minister took cost Canadians $300 million. How much longer will we be cutting big checks before a single home gets approved or even built?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Housing.
Madam Speaker, I have a good rapport with the colleague opposite. We work together on the HUMA committee, but it's hard to take him seriously in this House today when we know that recently he's voted against 99 units of housing for his own community. At 520 Isaac Street, he can go down. I'm sure he knows where that is. 99 units of housing have been built as a result of this government's funding. And that's what the National Housing Strategy is doing across the country. We've seen 125,000 people who are very close to being homeless off the streets. 70,000 people who were homeless off the street with wraparound supports.
The Honourable Member for Parry Sound Muskoka.
Madam Speaker, what's hard to take serious is that parliamentary secretary, because he knows full well that these big expensive photo ops in Mississauga and Toronto, for example, more housing than ever, is getting blocked despite them. Merely weeks after the Prime Minister's $471 million photo op in Toronto, the gatekeepers there said no to new housing right next door to a new transit station. Mississauga got a big $313 million check after having blocked 17,000 units in 2023. This photo op Prime Minister is failing Canadians. He's not worth the cost. And so when will this government stop buying housing photo ops and start delivering housing?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
If he wants to see the results of the National Housing Strategy, again, I remind him, go down to 520 Isaac Street in his riding. He can see the results, 99 units of housing. As far as the other points raised, he's talking about the Housing Accelerator Fund. Yes, we've concluded agreements with 30 communities that will incent change, zoning change that leads to the construction of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, mid-rise apartments and row houses and more. That's how we get Canadians housed. That's how we bring down costs. And Madam Speaker, they want to put taxes on the construction of apartments. And in addition, they want to continue measures that will not go ahead with more housing built in this country.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lilley, Kamouraska Rivière-du-Loup. Madam Speaker,
in the Lower St. Lawrence region, after 8 years of this government, the vacancy rate is incredibly low, and rents are skyrocketing. There are increases of up to 10%, or even more. This is very concerning. It's higher than the inflation rate, higher than the increase in wages. That means that rental households will get poorer. Why isn't this government doing something to make rents go down? The Honourable Government House Leader. Well, do you know what won't help construct new rental housing? As the member knows, their policy to bring back GST on new rental housing builds. That's their policy. It's in their bill. That's their leader's proposal. Builders are telling me that this GST change will enable thousands of new units to be built. I hope my colleague will look into that. The Honourable Member. Madam Speaker, the Governor of the Bank of Canada said yesterday that government spending will keep inflation and possibly interest rates high, which will increase home costs and mortgage renewal costs, as well as rents. After 8 years, this government still doesn't seem to understand that balancing the budget within a predictable time frame would simply be a common sense measure. Will this government take measures to get back to a balanced budget as soon as possible? In the next budget, in fact. Well, it's very interesting to see what the Conservative Party's history on this is.
Deficit is the story of the Conservative Party. In fact, what do we see now? A AAA credit rating, the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. We rank third in the OECD, Madam Speaker, when it comes to attracting foreign direct investment. Deal after deal has been concluded by the Minister of Industry, including in my region of southwestern Ontario and St. Thomas specifically, and Windsor, to see electric vehicle battery plants built. That gets Canadians working. Of course, we see also a very low unemployment rate, Madam Speaker.
Honorable député de Beauport. Mon Dieu, Beauport.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte-Beaupré, l'Île-d'Orléans, Charlevoix. Thank you. After 4 press conferences promising good news in January, the Minister of Fisheries has ultimately fallen way short of expectations. It's all very well to talk about opening up the rockfish fishery, but actually 60% of that will go to 30-meter ships, which actually is the only transition plan after drastically cutting shrimp quotas to a mere 3,060 tons to share with the Maritimes. That's nothing. There's no long-term vision here, neither to protect resources or the ecosystem. What will the minister do about this? Is she planning to end fishing in Quebec? Well, Madam Speaker, the situation for shrimp fishermen in the St. Lawrence is disastrous. Everyone agrees here that no one wants to fish the last shrimp. That's why, after a number of consultations, I announced a lowering of quotas for shrimp. That will enable shrimp stocks to rise again. At a time where we're facing climate change, our government will continue to offer solutions to our fishers, such as permit twinning. The Honourable Member. Well, given that there is a large amount of rockfish, which preys on small fish and shrimp, there's a real lack of vision here, and it shows a lack of consideration for the expertise of fishers. Fishers expect a real transition plan. Like things were 30 years ago. Things have gone backwards since then. A plan with financial compensation, a marketing strategy for rockfish and new products, and concrete alternatives for pelagic species, seals, seaweed, shrimp, and deep-sea fish. When will the minister finally propose a sustainable plan? The Honourable Minister. Madam Speaker, announcing the opening of the commercial rockfish fishery in 2024 after 30 years of a moratorium is great news. This is Groundhog Day all over again. And I guess that the Bloc Québécois is taking advantage of Groundhog Day to come out of its hole, because after all, for 6 months they haven't asked a single question about fisheries. The only thing that's entirely clear is that fisheries only matter to the Bloc Québécois when they can find votes at the end of their fishing line.
Kelowna Lake Country.
Madam Speaker, children under 18 in British Columbia can now be prescribed fentanyl. It's reported parents don't even need to be told or agree. Toxic drug overdose is now the leading cause of death for youth in British Columbia. It's also reported addiction experts have criticized protocols, citing they are deeply inadequate and do not provide a minimum age for when youth can receive recreational fentanyl. Will this NDP Liberal government put an end to their dangerous drug policy experiments, putting deadly fentanyl into the hands of...
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Conservatives are trying to spread fear and confusion. Here are the facts. No kids have been prescribed fentanyl in BC. Under the guidelines, there are additional precautions in place when it comes to prescribing to minors. The most important relationship in managing one's health is with a healthcare provider. Harm reduction is healthcare. We are working to save lives.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Madam Speaker, yesterday was absolutely shocking when first BC's top doctor said so-called safe supply is landing into street-level trafficking and ending up in the hands of children. Then the Liberal minister responsible for safe supply came to committee and doubled down on the Liberal NDP unwavering commitment to their deadly drug policy experiments. It's absolutely unbelievable. The government's addictive drugs end up in our kids' hands and the government endorses it. Will the NDP Liberal government end their deadly drug policy experiment and get the drugs out of our kids' hands?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Prescribed safe supply is a valued intervention and a necessary life-saving intervention. It helps connect to social supports and it is part of the continuum of care. We take the safety of all Canadians seriously and will continue to approach the toxic drugs and overdose crisis from both a public health and public safety perspective.
The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, crime is up nearly 40% across the country. The Liberals removed jail time for car theft in Bill C-5. And since then, car theft is up 300% in Toronto and 34% overall in Canada. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost or the crime. Every 6 minutes, a car is stolen. Insurance rates have risen as much as 50% at a time when Canadians can least afford it. Common sense Conservatives will bring back jail, not bail for criminals. Will the Liberals?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, it's interesting how the Conservatives are just waking up to the issue of auto theft in this country. This is something we have been working on with our local partners, including police. And Madam Speaker, while the Conservatives sit here and talk tough to cameras, just over 50 days ago, they actually voted against over $80 million that would go precisely to combat the issues that member is raising. Madam Speaker, they talk tough, but there's no action when it comes to actually dealing with crime in this country.
Honorable Député de Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel. Madam Speaker, we know that families throughout the country are facing an increase in the cost of living, including in my riding, Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel. The Canada Child Benefit is a source of support for families in my community. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families and Children tell the House about the impact that this important policy is having for Canadian families? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for this important question. We know that many people are indeed facing a difficult financial situation, and that's why we have brought in programs like the Canada Child Benefit, which was designed to support the most vulnerable among us. The Canada Child Benefit has lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty since 2016. It is indexed to the cost of living. Parents will now receive up to $7,437 per child under 6 years old, and up to $6,275 for children up to 17. This support is essential.
St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years, this NDP Liberal government isn't worth the cost or the corruption. The Minister of Industry conveniently claims that until recently he had no idea about corruption and self-dealing at the Liberals' $1 billion green slush fund. But we now know that his predecessor Navdeep Bains was informed as early as 2019 that the company of the Liberal appointed chair had received millions from the fund in a blatant conflict of interest. So in the face of that, how is it possible that the minister had no idea?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, let me be clear. As soon as we found out about these allegations, alleged allegations, the Department of ICE had acted quickly. The Minister of Innovation has already accepted the resignation of the CEO and the chair. We take these allegations extremely seriously, which is why we're following proper due diligence. Our government is committed to ensure that organizations which receive government funding adhere to the highest standards of governance. We are committed to getting to the bottom of these allegations. Thank you.
Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, nonsense. Not only had the minister's predecessor been informed of self-dealing on the part of the Liberal appointed chair, the minister sent officials to attend each Green Slush Fund board meeting in which board members funneled more than 20 million taxpayers' dollars to their own companies. And the minister claims he had no idea. Either the minister is grossly incompetent or he is misleading Canadians. Which is it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, this is just another example of the Conservatives willing to say anything to oppose us fighting climate change. This includes that they want to slash the funding to this organization that this Parliament in this House voted for over 20 years ago. We're sticking to the facts and to the due process. We'll continue fighting to get to the bottom of this. Thank you very much, Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Madam Speaker, on April 1st, this Liberal NDP government is going to automatically raise the tax on beer, wine and spirits for the 8th year in a row, without even a vote from elected MPs. When a simple treat like sharing a bottle of wine with a loved one becomes unaffordable, Canadians know that after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister stop this automatic annual tax increase and bring back happy hour for Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, we'll continue to work with the beer sector, with vintners, to ensure that they are competitive. And in fact, if we look at the wider Canadian economy, what do we see? A lower unemployment rate than existed before the pandemic. There's more jobs working now than before the pandemic. That party continues to put forward an austerity agenda that would do what? Cut pensions, cut EI, cut the Canada Child Benefit, dental care, child care, all of it. They don't believe in the social programs that have upheld this country in so many different ways. They don't believe in it by Canadians by extension. That's what I have to say to that member.
The Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Madam Speaker, the federal government can get more housing built by working with municipalities rather than insulting mayors like the Leader of the Official Opposition does. Through the Housing Accelerator Fund, we're working with the District of Squamish to fast-track the construction of an additional 200 homes over the next 3 years and over 1,300 homes over the next decade. And these are not just any homes. These are affordable, rental, and missing middle homes that the municipality has determined are badly needed in the community. Can the Parliamentary Secretary of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities please tell residents of Squamish how we're working with local partners to get more housing built faster at prices that they can afford?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'm happy to do exactly that, Madam Speaker, but let me first say that that member, his tireless advocacy led to agreements like the one completed with Squamish. And in fact, other MPs on this side have worked also to ensure outcomes through the Housing Accelerator Fund. I talked about it before, but it bears repeating. This is a fund that ensures incentives on municipalities' part to change zoning that will lead to more building in return for federal funding. What do we see as a result? Duplexes, fourplexes, triplexes, mid-rise apartments. All of these will lead to 500,000 homes being built over the next decade and 78,000 homes built over the next 4 years. That's how we get housing going.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Coatineau-Aski.
Northern Manitoba is seeing temperatures above zero. We've had weather that's unheard of these last 2 months. Thousands of people in our region depend on ice roads to survive. Because of the warm weather, some roads haven't opened and others will not last the season. The Liberals have failed to act quickly to combat the climate emergency that is hitting Indigenous communities the hardest. Investments in climate adaptation are needed now. An airport for Wasagamag, all-weather roads for St. Teresa Point, Oxford House, and York Landing. When will the Liberals finally act to deliver these life-saving investments?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'd like to thank the member opposite for her question and her dedication to this file. Indeed, Indigenous people all across Canada, and especially in northern areas, are feeling the brunt of climate change faster than other areas. I was at the United Nations last year where they told our government this, and our government is willing to work with their community and work with Indigenous communities to make sure that they have all the services that all Canadians have in Canada. Thank you very much.
Great answer.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, rather, on December 2nd, 2022, on February 15th, March 23rd, and September 25th, 2023, I asked questions about an outdated tax law that's been around for 30 years. It means that Canadian businesses are penalized by our tax system even though they're using local and healthy products. Things are getting more and more expensive, and it's harder for families to eat healthy products. By doing something about the situation, the government would be helping families buy healthy and cheaper food, and it would end this injustice, which means that SMEs are fighting multinationals in an unfair manner. Will the Finance Minister finally do something about this? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague. And I believe we should all work together to solve this situation. We want to support our local businesses and help them exist in a good business environment. This is a complex issue and we can't solve it overnight, but we will continue to work with him.
Well, that's all the time for question period today. Good to see you all. Daily routine of business. Dépôt de document.
Tabling of document.
Dépôt de projet.
Introduction of government bills.
Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations.
Presenting reports from committees.
Dépôt de projet.
Introduction of private members' bills.
First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Presenting petitions. Présentation de pétitions. The Honourable Member for Bow River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we changed. Thank you. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition on behalf of the people of Bow River, calling on the government to institute a national farmers market nutrition coupon program. The number of families who experience food insecurity increased by more than 12% since 21-22. In March of 23 alone, nearly 2 million people visited food banks. This government must act to find solutions, and this one is one of them, a national farmers market nutrition coupon program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétitions.
Presenting
petitions. The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Volunteer firefighters and search and rescue volunteers put their lives on the line for their fellow Canadians. They give their time, training, and efforts, and they also allow municipalities to keep property taxes lower than if paid services were required. I am presenting a petition calling on the government to increase tax credits for these essential volunteers and to support Bill C-310. Thank you.
Presenting the petitions, Présentation de pétitions, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm tabling today a very timely petition. This is constituents of mine that have signed a petition asking for all parliamentarians of all political parties to vote in favor of Bill 57, C-57, which is the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement, Mr. Speaker. I say very timely, and they're asking all of us to get behind it and vote for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, Présentation de pétitions, the Honourable Member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two petitions to present today, but prior to that, I do have a point of order that I think there was a missing statement by ministers made that the great prognosticator from Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, Wyerton Willie, predicted in early spring this morning. My first petition, Mr. Speaker, is Canadians, constituents of mine that are calling for the House of Commons and the Government of Canada to reverse the law extending eligibility for MAID to people with mental illness as the sole medical condition. Second petition, Mr. Speaker, that I'm presenting is to do with online verification for access to pornography obviously on the internet, and these petitioners are calling upon the House of Commons to adopt Bill S-210, protecting young persons from exposure to the Pornography Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting the petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm today here on behalf of the amazing volunteer fighters across my riding, as well as the search and rescue folks that volunteer a considerable amount to Canada. And I want to thank them because we know that volunteer firefighters are 71% of Canada's total firefighting essential first responders. We know that right now that the Tax Code of Canada allows volunteer firefighters and search and rescue volunteers to claim $3,000 in tax credit for 200 hours of service. We would like to see that raised to $10,000. We know, and as the member who put forward this bill, Bill C-310, the member from Courtenay, Alberta, that municipalities and communities get to keep their property taxes lower because they don't have to pay for these services. People put their life on the line for us. It's time that we do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting the petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm presenting a petition today on behalf of residents in my community. And to summarize, the Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel measures were in place to help Ukrainians and their family members come to Canada as quickly as possible. However, this program excludes many Ukrainians who came to Canada under the program who do not have family residing in Canada. Therefore, the petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada to make available a specialized permanent residency pathway for Ukrainians currently in Canada that does not require them to have Canadian citizen or permanent resident family member in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting the petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Sasamat volunteer firefighters protect Anmore and Belcara. And Coquitlam search and rescue volunteers also put their lives on the line for their fellow Canadians. They give their time, training, efforts, and also this allows municipalities to keep property taxes lower. If their services were paid, if their services as required were paid, this would be optimum. But at the moment, they're giving their time and their expertise as a volunteer. I'm presenting a petition calling on the government to increase the tax credits at the very minimum for these essential volunteers and to support Bill C-310.
Presenting the petitions, présentation pétition. Voila. Questions on the order paper? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask that all questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
There you go. Orders of the day. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I suspect if you were to canvass the House at this time, you might find unanimous consent to call it 1:30 so that we could begin private members' hour.
Is it agreed? It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
Private members' business, consideration at second reading of Bill C-352, Lowering Prices for Canadians Act. Standing in the name of Mr. Singh.
Therefore, resuming debate, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Saint-Michel.
Today I rise to address this chamber on Bill C-352, amending the Competition Act. I think we all agree in this chamber that a stronger competition enforcement regime will be good for all Canadians. The bill proposed by the New Democratic Party, while receptive to the need for change in competition law and generally aligned with the government's overall direction to date, must, however, be examined in light of the vast amount of changes that overlap with and have already been introduced by Bills C-56 and C-59. In the case of Bill C-56, this became law in December 2023, while Bill C-59 remains under consideration by Parliament at the present time. These are government bills that implement an overhaul of the Competition Act following the extensive consultation undertaken in 2022 and in 2023. The government receives a great deal of input throughout its consultations, bolstering the knowledge gained over the years of stewardship over this law. The amendment packages assembled in its two bills address most of the issues identified in law. that historically made it weaker than regimes of Canada's closest partners. That will no longer be the case. Modernizing the Competition Act is a necessary step in making Canada's economy more affordable for consumers and more fair and accessible to business. The government's extensive commitment to competition law reform, led by Bill C-56, the Affordable Housing and Groceries Act, followed by Bill C-59, the Fall Economic Statement Implementation Act 2023. Both of these bills are directed at enhancing the affordability and the competition, and together represent the most comprehensive reform package to the Competition Act in decades. They respond to the submissions of hundreds of very different stakeholders, including businesses, legal experts, academics, non-governmental organizations, and the Commissioner of Competition himself. Bill C-56 implemented a set of targeted but critical amendments, following especially from the Competition Bureau's market study on Canada's retail grocery sector. Mr. Speaker, as you already know, Bill C-56 brought much-needed changes, such as allowing information to be compelled under court order in the course of a market study, helping to remove barriers when diagnosing potential competition issues. Bill C-56 also repealed the efficiencies exceptions for anti-competitive mergers and collaborations, and in so doing, eliminated what many observers consider to have been the single biggest contributor to corporate concentration in Canada. The bill further allowed for better prevention and remedy of the abuse by larger players of their dominant position by requiring only proof of anti-competitive intent or effects to prohibit certain forms of conduct. This more appropriately allocates the burden of proof as compared to the previous test, which significantly limited the number of instances where the Bureau could intervene. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-56 addressed harm from collaborations between non-competing parties that are designed to limit competition. Once this provision is in effect, the Bureau will be able to review any type of collaboration whose purpose it is to restrain competition and seek a remedy, including an order to prevent the activity where competition is being substantially harmed or likely to. This is especially impactful on restrictive covenants between grocers and landlords, allowing more grocers to set up shop nearby competitors. Bill C-56, Mr. Speaker, was, of course, amended in committee through a multi-party effort, incorporating several of the elements in Bill C-352 that now no longer require consideration. Bill C-59 represents an even more substantial overhaul in our competition enforcement regime, addressing a large variety of aspects of the Competition Act. The amendments would give the Competition Bureau a longer period to detect and address anti-competitive mergers that are not notified in advance, helping to address killer acquisitions in the digital market. The bill would broaden the Bureau's review of competitors' collaboration to those that harmed competition in the past and allows for financial penalties to be sought when necessary. Importantly, Bill C-59 facilitates Bill C-59 facilitates private actions against a broader range of anti-competitive or harmful practices and empowers those affected to seek financial compensation in many cases. This improvement will complement the Bureau's work in protecting the marketplace. The bill also ensures that cost awards will not be ordered against the Commissioner of Competition in the vast majority of circumstances, another element addressed by Bill C-352. The bill also includes anti-reprisal provisions, ensuring that cooperation with the Bureau or participation in legal proceedings can't be punished by stronger businesses. Additionally, it is worth mentioning that Bill C-59 strengthens the law's testament of greenwashing, the false advertising of sustainability claims, while also facilitating environmentally beneficial collaborations that do not harm competition. Moreover, it ensures that a means of diagnosis or repair cannot be denied in a way that harms competition. Mr. Speaker, all in all, little remains in Bill C-352 that has already not been addressed. On the contrary, Bill C-59 includes several elements that are missing from this private member's bill. Mr. Speaker, the government's consultation saw over 130 stakeholders raise over 100 reform proposals. All submissions made by identified groups are publicly available, and the government published a What We Heard report synthesizing them. This public process has been a key source of input to help us develop reform proposal, and we are confident that the measures included in government bills comprehensively addresses the needs expressed by Canadians. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that the ambition of Bill C-352 correctly reflects the importance Canadians place in having a strengthened competition law framework. However, all of the major issues it raises have been or are being substantially dealt with through Bills C-56 and C-59. As such, I would encourage members of this House interested in advancing competition reform to prioritize the rapid passage of Bill C-59. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Continuing debate with the Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today to continue debate on this very important private member's bill that deals with amending the Competition Act to address the woeful lack of competition in our country, particularly a degrading lack of competition that has occurred after 8 years under this Liberal government. And I'm very disappointed to hear the previous Liberal speaker talk about how they intend to not support this legislation. They expect Canadians to trust them and trust that their legislation has all the solutions needed to solve the competition problems. But many of these competition problems, as I will show in my speech, have been caused by the sheer amount of consolidation that has happened in the Canadian marketplace under 8 years of this Liberal government. For example, Canadians pay the highest cell phone bills in the developed world, with 3 times more than Australia pays and twice as much as our neighbors in the United States. And I remember under the previous Conservative government how hard our government worked to bring in new wireless players into the Canadian market to help bring down prices for Canadian consumers. And all of this hard work was unraveled under this Liberal government with the merger of Rogers and Shaw, which eliminated a major new entrant into the market that was providing much needed competition. You can also look at our banking sector, which is extraordinarily controlled by 6 large banking firms, and now we've seen yet another takeover in the banking sector, which has further consolidated Canadians' mortgages under a relatively few amount of very large companies. And finally, also just look at the amount of consolidation happening in our airline sector, with Canada dominated 85% by just 2 large airlines, and more mergers coming, and the government even going after some of the new players with tax bills that are threatening to take out new players out of our airline market. You know, when this Liberal government came to power nearly a decade ago, Canadians had a choice of 8 Canadian grocery chains. And now, after 8 years of this Liberal government, we're dominated by just 3 Canadian companies and 2 American multinational corporations. Mr. Speaker, these are not signs of a healthy, dynamic, and competitive marketplace. They are signs of a country which has an outdated approach to competition. And the reality is that this is a Canadian problem. And while this Liberal government blames international trends on the increasing prices we're seeing at the grocery stores and on our cell phone bills, the fundamental problem is the lack of choice that Canadians have, and it's forcing consumers to pay more. The Competition Act is in desperate need of reform, and it is rooted in a history of an industrial policy that sought to protect large Canadian companies from foreign competition, but it does nothing to promote competition domestically. And in fact, I'm not even sure if the goal of having these companies protected so that they can grow is even achieving those ends in this country, because they're so protected. We're not seeing the innovation that we need in this country to really develop the next level of technologies and practices. Canada's weak competition laws allow a very few cartels to dominate whole industries. They shut out competitors, they drive up profits, and in this process, consumers are the obvious victims. They pay more for goods and services, and these aren't always of the best quality, and this lack of choice leaves Canadians with no other options. And now, this doesn't just affect consumers. Indeed, the impact of this failing Competition Act has immense consequences on small and medium-sized producers. I come from an area with a lot of farmers, and we know that these big companies dictate prices to these farmers, and that really has an impact on them as well. You know, my riding is also home to one of Canada's largest family-owned grocery chains, Freson Brothers, which was founded in 1955. And Freson Brothers, I'm very proud that they're in my riding. They have a number of locations across Alberta. I believe they're the largest grocery store chain that isn't part of the major grocery store chains in Canada. They're really known for their high-quality products. They have excellent butcher shops. They have their own brand of sourdough, which is actually listed in one of the museums for bread across the world. I believe it's in Belgium, and they've developed a made-in-Alberta sourdough bread. We're very proud of that. You can walk into any Freson Brothers location in Alberta, and you'll immediately sense the high standard of care and quality that they put into all their products. And this is a great example of a made-in-Canada business that promotes excellence and craftsmanship in their field. Now, sadly, many smaller companies like Freson Brothers face immense hurdles to participate in the market. This high concentration of control amongst the very large companies has entrenched players that have become price setters in the market. When the Loblaws and the Walmarts of the world dictate what the prices will be for the products on the shelves, it's the smaller players that end up holding the bag and paying higher prices. Take Coca-Cola, for example. Loblaws controls 62% of the Canadian market for Coca-Cola. That means that Loblaws effectively determines what the price is, not only for consumers, but for what all the other smaller players and distributors are paying as well. Now, how can smaller companies compete with these tactics? The answer is they can't. If you walk in any grocery store aisle, you can be sure that the price that smaller grocery stores pay for items like soda and other products is higher than that paid by the major players. It's a huge competitive edge. And while it may save consumers a couple of cents at the stores, it comes at the cost of eliminating real competition that would create long-term better prices for consumers. Now, I'd ask my colleagues in the government what happened to their concerns over the middle class and those working hard to join them. After 8 years of their reckless spending and fiscal incompetence, we know that for a fact that hardworking Canadians are worse off. They're taxed more than ever, and they're paying more for these basic goods and services that they need to live their lives. Now, Roger, for example, you know, the cost of, and as we've seen, Canada's weak competition laws continue to serve the interests of these large established players to the detriment of new players. Now, I want to talk about one very specific aspect of the competition rules that I don't think has been talked about enough. And one of those aspects is the term of restrictive covenants in real estate development. And what is a restrictive covenant, you may ask? Well, I'll tell you, it's when a developer buys land intending to build a grocery store and other businesses, a strip mall, for example, and they'll often be approached by one of the big players saying, we want to put our location in your area, and it's going to attract all these other ancillary businesses that want to be involved. So attracting a big store like a Walmart is a big draw for a lot of small businesses who want to build in these big parking lots and in these well-attended locations. Now, the Walmarts and the superstores of the world don't want to enter a development if they think they're going to face competition. And so on the one hand, I think it is completely fair that a grocery store doesn't want to have another grocery store right next to them in the same parking lot, but I don't think it's fair when you have restricted covenants that say somebody can't start a small butcher shop or a small boutique bakery because there's a bakery or a butcher shop in the grocery store, and they pass these restrictive covenants that say no other business can engage in any business that the grocery store is engaged in. And so I really think what we're doing is we're sterilizing the business sectors in our communities, and it's because of these restrictive covenants. And that's really preventing a lot of small and medium-sized butchers and bakers and other businesses that compete with the grocery stores from getting into these developments and from producing their superior boutique products. And I really think this is an area of the Competition Act that we need to look at much more deeply, because I feel that it is not only giving a huge advantage to these big incumbent players, but it's also really hurting our small and medium-sized enterprises and our consumers. Now, as you can see, Mr. Speaker, our current competition laws are seriously lacking the sophistication and are a major contributor to the problem. And far from creating competition, the current regime allows for the proliferation of monopolies all across our economy. Now, the Competition Bureau has said that we need to encourage foreign companies to enter the Canadian market. Now, I'm not necessarily against foreign companies, but I'm wondering to myself why the minister is spending so much time burning up the phones, trying to bring a big foreign new player into the Canadian market when we haven't even addressed the rules and the barriers that are preventing great Canadian companies like the Friesen Brothers of the world and other companies from being able to compete in the Canadian market. Why can't we remove the barriers so that we can allow a small and medium-sized Canadian business to become a big grocery player rather than always having to go abroad to look to bring in another grocery player? Now, as the Friesen Brothers told me in a text message, they said innovation is at the heart of small and medium-sized businesses, and survival is the driver, and community is the beneficiary. Now, I would like to support this update to the law. I think there are a lot of things in here that could help, and I look forward to this passing and being studied at committee, because it's companies like Friesen Brothers and other small grocery stores and boutique bakeries and butchers that are the real fabric of our community, that make our communities so special and unique. And we need to do everything we can as parliamentarians to create a business climate that promotes Canadian innovators, promotes Canadian investment, promotes Canadian jobs, and that creates the competition that we need in this country to ensure that we have that dynamic marketplace that will provide the benefits that this country so sorely needs in this troubling economy. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, l'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's important to strengthen the Competition Act, and C-352 makes proposals to that end. For example, it amends the Competition Act to increase penalties for certain anti-competitive acts. It changes as well aspects of the review for mergers, in particular how gains in efficiencies and market concentration are taken into account. Furthermore, it requires the Competition Tribunal to make an order dissolving a completed merger or prohibiting the merger from completion if the merger would result in an excessive combined market share. The limitation period for the review of mergers would be extended from 1 year to 3 years. Finally, it amends the Competition Tribunal Act to remove the tribunal's ability to award costs against the Crown. All good things, which is why the Bloc Québécois will support Bill C-352. That said, Madam Speaker, I would like to remind you of a specific situation, a very specific and special situation. Last fall, Bill C-56 was debated, then amended, and passed. Half of it dealt with amendments to the Competition Act. And we can remember that in order to get the NDP to support the gag order, M30, the government amended C-56 to include several elements of C-352. So a number of elements from C-352 found their way into C-56. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, the big chunk of C-352 that was missing from C-56, well, I brought that to committee, and it was adopted. Remember that the committee chair had ruled the amendment inadmissible, but his decision was overturned by all the committee members, and this was not challenged in the House. So, C-352 contains some very good things, but most of it was already passed last fall. I therefore question the relevance of debating this bill again, given that its substance has already been adopted by this House. A bit, Madam Speaker, like Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, all that remains is the carcass of the marlin, poor Santiago. So, Madam Speaker, we're going to vote in favor of this carcass and note in committee that its substance has already been adopted. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Portmody-Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I am so happy to be standing up for Canadians today on Bill C-352. This is finally addressing the anti-competitive behavior that's been going on in Canada for decades, supported by the Liberal governments and the Conservative governments before them. Both of those governments have been back and forth ping-ponging the government status in this country for decades, and they have done nothing about the fact that consumers have been being ripped off in the market. So I just want to say thank you to the member from Burnaby South for raising this important debate in the House of Commons to finally address the lack of competition in this country and the overpriced goods and services that Canadians need to survive. Canadians woke up this week to the news that the corporate control of their medication was a reality. Both Loblaws and Manulife potentially colluded together to limit access to life-saving medication for people in this country. Galen Weston is involved in Loblaws. We all know that. Galen Weston has been to committee many, many times about the skyrocketing price of groceries. We all know that the statement has been made that by Mr. Weston that these kind of profits are fine. There's nothing wrong with taking these kinds of profits. And meanwhile, Canadians and people in my riding, Madam Speaker, are struggling to put food on the table. Galen Weston, as an individual and as an influencer in the Canadian economy, has already got a disproportionate amount of control over people's ability to eat in this country. Now we are in a situation where Galen Weston and Loblaw's company is going to have even more control over whether or not you, your family member, or your friends have the medication they need to stay alive. This is serious business, Madam Speaker. And although the Competition Board oversees anti-competitive behavior, they have not had the teeth to be able to enforce and to make change. And I've been in this House all morning, Madam Speaker, and I heard the Conservatives say they're there to create a business climate. This is the moniker of the Conservatives, and this is how they've actually won elections, basically, in the past. Talking about how smart they are on the economy and how smart they are on business and how they're going to make business so great. And I can tell you that the Conservatives are complicit in the fact that you are paying too much for your groceries, you are paying too much for your cell phone bills, you are paying too much for your medication. And I could go on, Madam Speaker, because the Conservatives work for corporate and corporations, and they have no idea how to run an economy. And it bothers me as a woman standing in this chamber, Madam Speaker, as a woman that spent 25 years in the grocery industry, many of those years as a business analyst, many of those years out in the field as a salesperson, working both in Europe and in the United States and in Canada, that because I'm a woman, that my voice doesn't know what I'm talking about. Yet the Conservatives on their bench have a number of members, men, that talk down to me, speak to me like I don't know what I'm talking about, when they've never had a job outside of a fast food restaurant chain.
That's right.
I don't appreciate it, Madam Speaker. Canadians don't appreciate it because those members, the Conservatives now in the past and the Liberals now in the past, have been hoarding the profits that belong to Canadians through their taxes, and those Canadians should have access to medication when they need it, dental care when they need it, and also, Madam Speaker, they should have a national food program so that no child in this country goes to school hungry. And the Conservatives like to say that kids go to school hungry because their parents can't afford food. It's true, Madam Speaker. Families are having a hard time affording food. And you know why? Because they're time-starved and they're wage-starved because of the policies of 5 decades of the Conservatives and the Liberals. I know amazing parents, Madam Speaker, that don't have time to be able to get their children a healthy meal in the morning and a healthy meal at lunchtime and a healthy meal in the afternoon because the capitalist-driven Conservatives and Liberals made the decision that they wanted those parents working 12, 13, 14 hours a day. And I think about nurses, Madam Speaker, and women that are working in the care economy, women that are working in long-term care home, immigrants that are coming to this country to work in families, Madam Speaker, in people's homes, that are being paid minimal, that don't get status for themselves or their family, and their work is precarious. If they dare speak up and talk about the terrible working conditions that they're forced into, they might get deported. It's tragic, Madam Speaker. Yet the Conservatives have the gall to stand up in this House today and say that they're creating good business climate and that they're concerned that too many people are going to the food bank. This is legislated choice, Madam Speaker, legislated poverty that is perpetuated by the Liberals, started by the Conservatives, and continues today. And I will go to the Canada Disability Benefit. I can't believe that I'm the only one that receives daily messages from people with a disability in this country living in poverty, getting displaced by these corporate Conservative decisions and these corporate Liberal decisions that decided that the best thing that we could do was upzone every property in this country and give it all to the developers to build luxury condos and to stick seniors out in tents on the street. And I know the member from Edmonton-Griesbach has been talking about this for a very long time, that people are living in tents in minus 35 weather. I think about the member from Nunavut that talks about no investment in housing. People in Nunavut are sleeping in shifts in bedrooms of two-bedroom homes where 12 people live. Wow. It's disgusting that these governments, Liberals and Conservatives, have done this for decades. They know it. The Prime Minister walks down Sparks, walks down Wellington, can see that people are homeless and struggling. And what do? What do? They start to claw back people's CEBA. If you're a low-income person that needed CEBA and needed your government benefits, they've decided that they're going to claw back your government benefits now so that you can repay back your CEBA. But the corporate CEO that's not paying his fair share of taxes, that took wage subsidy and gave it to their shareholders, they're fine. So, Madam Speaker, you can see I'm a little bit upset today because I listened to the House and some of these debates today, and I even heard my Bloc colleagues say it didn't matter. This debate didn't matter. For Canadians, this debate matters. It's an antiquated law, the anti-competitive law. It hasn't been looked at. It's putting Canadians at risk. And I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that it wouldn't stand in any other country of this world that a person, one person, someone like Galen Weston, could have so much influence over what you eat, what medication you can take, and in general controls the narrative of what Liberals and Conservatives will say in this House. So today, I'm going to stand up for the NDP and say we are there. We are there working for Canadians. No other party in this House is.
Assuming debate, the Honourable Member for Nunavut.
I am pleased to rise on behalf of my constituents in Nunavut. The leader of the NDP, member for Burnaby South, has tabled a particularly important bill that can have great benefits for Nunavummiut. Bill C-352, an act to amend the Competition Act and Competition Tribunal Act, is of interest to us because it is all about lowering prices. I thank him for tabling C-53 because there is too much corporate control in Ottawa. I like the way that the leader of the NDP put it. He said, I quote him, "The corporate-controlled Conservatives set up a system that continues to benefit wealthy CEOs. The big lobby Liberals continue to protect the interests of those greedy CEOs." End quote. The leader of the NDP clearly understands the realities experienced by my constituents, and the NDP join him in this fight to stop greedy CEOs who exploit Canadians. As the fourth party in this House, we have fought the hardest and got the most results for Canadians. Bill C-352 is yet another example of what an NDP government would look like. Making changes in federal systems that make it easy to afford food, to afford the cost of living, and indeed not be punished by corporate greed. Competition is particularly challenging in Nunavut. The merger of First Air with Canadian North has seen the impacts of the lack of competition. If this bill had been in place during the First Air and Canadian North merger, anti-competitive rules would have been stronger. There would have been a better review of the merger, including how gains in efficiency and market concentration would be taken into account. I believe that the merger of the two airlines would have been prevented, given that this merger resulted in excessive combined market share. The merger between Canadian North and First Air is not likely to restore competition in the airline industry in Nunavut. I challenge Nunavut Crown corporations to buy into the airline industry and increase the market share. Canadian North, while Inuit-owned, is owned by two corporations outside of Nunavut. I will admit, while I appreciate the services provided by Canadian North, it is the lack of competition that allows astronomical prices, like a person from Grise Fiord in my riding going to Ottawa at the price of over $11,000. The distance between Grise Fiord and Ottawa is only 3,461 kilometers. For a similar distance between Ottawa and Victoria, British Columbia, the price of an airline ticket is $500. In the alternate, I challenge Air Canada and WestJet to increase the market share of the airline industry in Nunavut. The airline industry is our lifeline. The healthcare system is too lacking, resulting in multi-million dollars spent on airline tickets for my constituents to attend everything from the most basic doctor's appointments to more complicated and lengthy procedures only available south of Nunavut. A direct impact of the merger includes the cost of groceries and the cost of alleviating poverty. Recently, the Minister of Northern Affairs showed that he will cut a portion of the Nutrition North program that directly helps people to feed each other. The Minister of Northern Affairs is opting to subsidize CEOs and larger for-profit corporations by keeping that portion without review and without consideration for alleviating poverty. When the Conservatives were in power, food prices went up by 25%. What does this mean? Here are some examples of some prices that went up. Ground beef went up by 128%, coffee went up 89%, apples, and we all know the conservatives love apples, went up by 43%. When the Conservatives were in power, what went down in that same period were the taxes to corporate groceries that stores paid. That is, the Conservatives gave massive tax giveaways to the richest corporations, hurting Canadians and benefiting their rich friends. It does not have to be this way. The leader for the NDP said in introducing this bill, I quote, "That is why we are putting forward our bill. The Lowering Prices for Canadians Act, which would bring down prices for Canadians, take power away from those greedy CEOs and give it back to the working people," end quote. NDP are fighting for Canadians who are suffering the increasing cost of living allowed by this Liberal government. The Liberals and the Conservatives will show their commitment to Canadians when they vote on Bill C-352. I asked the same questions that the NDP leader asked. Quote, will they stand with their rich CEO friends, or will they stand with their working class Canadians? Will they stand with workers, families, and people who are having a hard time buying groceries? End quote. As our leader did, I too invite the Liberals and Conservatives to stop listening to their CEO friends, start listening to working Canadians, and support our bill to bring down prices for all Canadians. This bill will stop mergers which end up hurting Canadians, like the merger of Rogers and Shaw, which reduces competition, increases prices, and a means of loss of jobs. This NDP will increase penalties for consumer scams, help grocery stores by protecting them from anti-competitive tactics used by big chains. This NDP bill will give the Competition Bureau more power to crack down on abuses such as price gouging and stop mergers that reduce competition and hurt Canadians. As a result of greedy corporations making huge profits, Canadians are struggling. When we ask Canadians, they agree. They believe the number one reason driving up the cost of groceries is more money going into the pockets of rich CEOs. As the NDP leader believes, as do I believe we need more competition and not less. I believe we need more protections for consumers and not more power for CEOs. That is exactly what our bill will do.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the two colleagues that spoke before me. I really appreciated both of their interpretations of this particular bill and the meaning that it has. So I am here today to speak on our leader's bill, Bill C-352, that talks about amending the Competition Act and the Competition Tribunal Act to increase competition and lower prices for Canadians. Now, Madam Speaker, my husband's culture is the most northern Coast Salish in Canada, and their nation is Hamathko. And one of the things that they're very clear in, and their teachings are very clear in, is that greed is actually considered a profound illness. And if a member of their community shows a lot of greed and holding on to wealth, there's a lot of work that is done to help that person not be in that place of greed. And the reason that they feel that this is an important issue is that the core value of their community is together we are stronger. That's basically the core value. So if somebody is suffering, then it is a weight upon all of us to make sure that we lift that person up and support them in the way that they need to be supported. And unfortunately, that is not the system that we see currently in Canada. I think most Canadians know the reality that the system is rigged. It is rigged to support the very, very wealthy, the 1% people of Canada. We see this not just in Canada, but in many other countries, and we know it's extremely unfair. And what bothers me the most about how our system is rigged right now, and again, we've seen this in a lot of statistics that show that the wage earning of everyday Canadians continues to be stagnant, while the very, very wealthy are seeing huge increases in their wage earnings and their incomes. And so that tells us that everyday Canadians are going to continue to struggle because we have greed in this country out of control. And that's That's where we are. And so when we look at what's happening in our grocery stores right now, where people are really struggling to be able to afford the basic things that they need to feed their families and to be treated with dignity. And I know I bring this up a lot in this House, that I think there should be a bar of dignity in this country, and I believe that fits in with the teachings from the Hamalko people, where it's like we understand that everybody deserves dignity. So if somebody has a strength or a weakness, we find a way to celebrate what is good and strong, and we find ways to support and love through those weak moments. And we're not seeing that right now. We're seeing a lot of people who are doing everything right. They are following the rules that they think are fair, and they see themselves falling further and further behind. And it makes me think of a lot of young people who are worried about the fact that they may not be able to afford a home, they may not be able to ever have a wage, a livable wage that will give them the ability to build the things in their life that they want to build. And so as we look at this system and acknowledge it's rigged, the worst thing that we can do is say, let's just not have a system to address that. You know, I like to believe the best in people. I tend to be a fairly trusting person. I believe in the essential good in everyone. But I also know that if you have a system that doesn't keep engaging and making sure that things are fair, there are people who will turn that system to feed themselves at the expense of other people. And that's what we have right now. We are watching people like Galen Weston walk away with multi-million-dollar raises while the workers at Loblaws can't even afford to buy groceries at the store that they work in. We're seeing more and more people struggling to pay for basic groceries when we're also seeing much higher outcomes and profits for these grocery stores. And what's frustrating is we see that there is just this out-of-touch Liberal Party that calls them in and sort of says to them nicely, can you stop raising your prices? It's really hurting the Canadian consumer. And that's sort of a talk, but it doesn't actually say, hey, this isn't fair. We're going to put something in place that makes it fair. And then we have the corporate-controlled Conservatives, quite honestly, who have 50% of their governing body are lobbyists for greedy CEOs. Like, that's who they're talking to. That's their leadership. That's who's helping them plot their own course moving forward. And that worries me, because it means that everyday people doing everything right are continuing to be marginalized because our systems don't hold those folks to account. So what will this bill do? Well, the first thing it will do is actually will increase penalties for price fixing. And Madam Speaker, we all know about this. We know that sometimes prices are fixed and the consumer is paying way more than they should. And, you know, when I look at this, it just reminds me of the reality that Loblaws recently tried to decide that instead of giving, you know, almost expired food at 50% off, they were only going to do 30% off. It's like they're nickel and diming people who are struggling and doing their best every day to get by just taking away every opportunity for something that they can afford. The other thing this bill does is it helps smaller grocery stores by protecting them against anti-competitive tactics from bigger players. Let's be honest. We all know this, especially people who are small businesses. When you've got a player in town that's really big corporation and they've got tons of resources, they can undermine you really easily. We need something in place that keeps that at a level playing field. And we know that a lot of big grocery stores, if you're within a certain radius of where they're providing their grocery stores, if you can do a lower price for the consumer, you're told you can't because it's anti-competitive. And so what happens? You have to raise your prices, even though you could give it to somebody at a lower price. That is wrong. That is those big corporate giants coming into people who are working hard, who care about their community, or trying to make things affordable and taking away their ability to do that. So this bill will fix that. It also gives the Competition Bureau more powers to crack down on abuse like price gouging consumers. This is a real thing. Now, the Conservatives will tell you that it's all just about the carbon tax. You know, when you look at the stats, and I will get to that a little bit later on, you will see the huge amount of corporate profits that we are seeing in the last little while. So even with taxes that are going up, they're still drawing in way more than they did back in 2020. That worries me, and it tells me that they are using this opportunity to mislead Canadians and tell them that they have to pay more even when they don't need to. It's because we don't have strong enough anti-competition laws in this country. And of course, the other thing it does is it will stop mergers that decrease competition and hurt Canadians. You know, we've just seen this. We saw Rogers take over Bell, and they were like, no, we promise we're not going to raise our costs. We're not going to raise our prices. What did they do? They just recently raised their prices. You know, one of the things about Canada that concerns me is we don't ever see a government, whether it be Liberal or Conservative, take on this real issue of competition and make sure that when people are getting scammed, that they do something about it. They're just too nice because they know where their money comes from. That's what I will say in this House. And it's shocking. So right now we have 5 companies for grocery stores: Loblaw, Sobeys, Metro, Costco, and Walmart. They dominate. There's little ones every once in a while, and I saw in BC that we've lost some of those small grocery stores who've been picked up from Sobeys. This is shocking. It means that when there's only those 5, they just talk to each other. How much do we want to get out of this area? How much do we want to get out of this area? There's no more little grocery store in the corner who's doing their best to keep the costs down. We can just wipe them out. That's what's happening in this country, and the consumer are paying, and the people that work the hardest are paying the most. If you're making $250,000 a year, you're not going to care if your grocery store's prices go up. But if you're only making $20,000, $30,000, and there's a lot of seniors living on that in this country, you're certainly going to feel it, and you're going to be making terrible, terrible decisions that no Canadian with any bar of dignity here could actually see taken. I want to remind everybody that margins generally increase by 1 to 2% points. That's been where it's been at. And now we're seeing huge. We know that the 3 largest grocery stores last year alone, in 2022, I should say, Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro made more than $3.6 billion combined in profits. So while everyday Canadians are suffering, the reality is that we don't have a system that's going to be making it fair for everyday Canadians. So I hope everybody in this House supports this bill so that we can make things fair for Canadians, because they certainly deserve it when they're doing everything right. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resume. Yeah, the honourable member the honourable person cannot speak. The honourable member for Edmonton Grisba.
The United Nations proclaimed the federal government as outlawed, and that it is the same as slavery.
Edmonton Grisba.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise in support of Bill C-352, which seeks to amend the Competition Act and the Competition Tribunal Act to increase competition and lower prices for Canadians. Madam Speaker, in order to do this in a way that builds confidence for Canadians, one must understand the philosophies of both the Liberal and the Conservative parties. And Canadians are going to be shocked to find that they're actually quite similar in their approach to how the market and how the needs and wants of Canadians are truly met, or not met in many cases. We know that Canadians across the country, both unionized and non-unionized labor, are falling further behind, and they're doing everything right. Some of them are having to pick up extra jobs, they're having to take a side gig while missing time with their families, while not having the chance to see their kids off to bed or being able to see them in the morning because they're just working too hard. Madam Speaker, no Canadian, no matter where they are, from coast to coast to coast, should have to work more than one full-time job in order to put a roof over their head, food on their plate, and to make sure their kids have what they need. That's the promise that New Democrats have been consistent about. We know that the material wealth and the material need of Canadians is paramount to how they participate in our democracy. Our great tradition in this place, in Canada, is a democratic one. A democratic one that says that each and every one of us, no matter who you are, where you live, how much you make, or who you love, has a chance to participate. That Canada is your home. As a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, Canadians from every corner of our country have died for this promise. Those who bravely fought overseas during World War II to fight the terrible and fascist regime of the Nazis, to stand up for the very basic principles that we all stand here today. Those principles say that you should be able to participate in our democracy without let or hindrance and without discrimination. However, Madam Speaker, we haven't done the work to ensure that the social rights of those individuals are met so that they can actually enjoy the democratic rights to which they are granted. How do we fulfill the social rights of Canadians? Well, it's particularly important to delineate the wants and needs of Canadians. It is an important need to ensure that we have housing, that we have food, that we have the clean water and an environment that we can actually breathe fresh air in. Madam Speaker, these aren't things that Canadians shouldn't lack of. They shouldn't have to beg for these things. They shouldn't have to work 4 jobs for these things. They should have to just work 1 and be able to get the social supports to enact their democratic rights. The Conservatives and the Liberals have an interesting philosophy when it comes to the market. They say that we should just incentivize every single billionaire out there to do the government's job of helping people. We spoke, for example, to the real estate executives in our country, and they've been clear that they cannot solve the housing crisis we're seeing in Canada. And I wish that the Liberals and Conservatives would listen to that. Those who are motivated to make money in the housing sector have said that they cannot create the conditions for all Canadians to have a home. When you hear that, it's up to Social Democrats to then say the failures of Liberal policies, both the Liberal policies of the Conservatives and the Liberal policies of the big L Liberals, are actually challenged. That we introduce the social democratic principles that are important to ensuring that they get the true wealth transfer that's required of them in order to actually exercise their democratic rights. And it's been commented oftentimes, especially today in the 21st century, particularly by my generation, the lack of understanding of that in this place. We no longer debate these principles. All we hear from the Conservatives is slogans for them. They won't even speak about the fact that their philosophy to motivate the private markets failing here at the stage that we're in capitalism, which is the most ultimate late stage capitalism that has billionaires and oligarchies across our country controlling the means, the exclusive means of production. When that happens, Madam Speaker, what we see quickly is price fixing, price gouging, and people falling behind. And I wish that my Liberal and Conservative colleagues would take this seriously. But instead, what we're going to hear for the many, many more months to come from every single Conservative on that side is 4 slogans. And those 4 slogans will be said over and over and over again, and they won't even engage in the reality that their consecutive tradition of working with the Liberals to pat the backs of their lobbyist friends, and now they're upset because we're calling that out. They're upset because they won't admit that consecutive decades in our country, the Conservatives and Liberals have benefited from the immense tax breaks they give their friends. It's been very clear, Madam Speaker, that for the chief strategist for the Conservative Party, a lobbyist for Loblaws, my God, we're in this exact position. And so I'm sure that the strategic advice, Madam Speaker, from the Conservatives' chief strategist is one to not actually take into account the reality that her boss, Galen Weston, is gouging Canadians, price fixing the cost of bread. And we need more courage in this place in order to actually understand these circumstances and then bring forward good ideas, because Canadians are running out of hope because they're not hearing solutions. They're hearing the problem. And to give credit to the Conservatives, I really do think they've done a good job outlining the concerns and feelings of Canadians. That's something we agree on. We agree that Canadians are falling behind. We agree that Canadians are being price gouged. We agree that housing is more unaffordable now more than ever. But we disagree with the solutions. We know that taking 4 cents off a $100 basket of groceries is just not going to cut it. Cutting the carbon tax is 4 cents off of a $100 basket of groceries. GST is higher than that, Madam Speaker. We are consistent in our approach that the immense record profits of these companies that are being avoided and not held accountable need to be reined in. We need to break up these oligarchies. We need to support our small and medium-sized businesses, and we need to fill the social gap that exists when we allow mega corporations to continue their never-ending and continuous appetite against working people in our country. And I invite members of both the Conservatives and Liberal Party to engage with us in this debate in a meaningful way, beyond slogans, present more solutions. Here's one of them, and we hope you support it. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate. Is the House ready for the question? La question est la...
The question is as follows. Mr. Singh, seconded by Ms. Barron, moved that Bill C-352, an act to amend the Competition Act and the Competition Tribunal Act, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology.
If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person, the Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And of course, we will be requiring a recorded division.
Pursuant to Standing Order 93, the division stands deferred until Wednesday, February 7th, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions.
As it is 1:10 p.m., the House stands adjourned until next Monday at 11 a.m., pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.
Well, that's it, everybody. It looks like they shut it down early today. For those of you that are new to the channel, please hit the like and subscribe button. Share it so that we can get this video content out. People become more aware of what's going on in their political system. And we'll see you later.